Hey everybody, listen up. I got mega huge news. Meat Eater Live is heading back out on the road. That's right. Join me and the crew. Clay Newcomb, Cal, Yanni, Spencer's going to be there. Phil the Engineer's going to be there. Meat Eater Live headed back out. Now, when you get every ticket, okay? Every ticket you buy, you get a signed copy of our new Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook. This tour is celebrating the release of the book. Buy a ticket, get a signed copy, Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, camp stove, and campfire, which I'll point out is a $38 value. Here's where we're going to go. April 23rd, the Mesa Art Center in Mesa, Arizona. April 24, the Balboa Theater in San Diego. April 25, the Grove in Anaheim, California. April 27, the Crest Theater in Sacramento. April 29, the Union in Salt Lake City. April 30, the Egyptian in Boise. May 1, the Wilma Theater in Missoula. May 2, the Bing Crosby Theater in Spokane, Washington. May 4, Revolution Hall in Portland, Oregon. And May 5, the last day of the tour, Pantages Theater in Tacoma, Washington. For tickets and more information, visit the events page at themeateater.com. Hope to see you at the show.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this is episode number 386. And today in the show, I'm joined by Aaron Warbritton and Greg Clements from the Hunting Public to talk about hunting the whitetail rut on public land or heavily pressured properties. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by Onyx. Today, we're talking the rut, right? It's that time of year, and we've got a great lineup for it with Greg Clements and Aaron Warbritton from the Hunting Public. Hopefully you guys are watching their stuff. It's great. They have been able to kill a lot of great deer on public land all across the country, and they're doing it in some really interesting and aggressive ways. So today we dive into all of those different strategies they're using, the things they've learned, basically every different thing you could possibly want to know about chasing deer in places where other people are chasing them too. That's what we're going to learn about. So highly recommend this. Now, that said, we kind of have a two-part episode here because we also have an introduction conversation with myself and the nine-fingered wonder, Dan Johnson. We had to catch up on our hunts. So if you are a longtime listener and you care about what I'm doing in the woods or what Dan's doing in the woods, tune into that one. And that's something like the first 40 or 45 minutes. And if you want to hear about how my personal rut hunts have been going, I've been hunting, I think 15 out of the last 17 days, I believe. So you'll hear about my public land hunt in Ohio, and you're going to hear about the first 7, 8, 9 days or so of my hunt for Tran, my number one buck in Michigan. It's been an up and down roller coaster ride. So if you want to hear about that, including a little something that I borrowed from the Hunting Public playbook, you should tune into that part. But if you don't care about that and you just want to get to Aaron and Greg, fast forward about 40, 45 minutes and we'll get into that conversation. And then there'll be another, hour and 45 minutes of straight strategy talk. So we got a real banger of an episode. I should stop talking so you can get into it. But I will tell you here in the beginning, I hope you're having a blast out there in the woods. I hope you are putting everything we've been talking to into action, executing on these ideas, and chasing that dream that November is. Make sure you're enjoying it. I know that I sometimes get hung up on the success, quote unquote, and whether or not I'm achieving my goal, and it takes away the fun on occasion. I've been guilty of this. I'm falling prey to it a little bit this year. Try not to do that. Try to learn from my mistakes and getting too worked up and stressed about these things, and just enjoy each day for what it is, because that's why we're hunting, right? If you can't be out there enjoying it, enjoying the nature around you and the process and the chase itself, then what the heck are you doing? Fill the freezer, yeah. Kill some bucks, yeah, but enjoy everything that gets you there in the first place. So that's it for me today. Good luck, and here is my conversation with Dan And then after that, Aaron and Greg. Enjoy. And now I've got the one and only Dan Johnson with us. I'm glad we're finally getting to do this. I've wanted to have you on for a couple weeks, and our schedules are just a mess lately. But we got a lot we have to catch up on because both of us have been pretty busy over the last couple weeks with hunts, and we got to cover those. So
projects. Oh yeah. So I think I told you. I know I told you this when I was in Michigan, but I don't think we ever, discussed it on air. But so we had like this home remodeling project that was supposed to get done this summer. Well, it kept getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, and it's still not finished. But we're at a stopping point, so I can disappear for 2 weeks, type of deal. You know what I mean? So on Saturday, I literally finished painting and putting hardware on these cabinets and doing some other stuff to where I can go hunt now.
Thank goodness. Just in the nick of time.
Just in the nick of time. That's a fact.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. You've managed to get out hunting quite a bit this year, though, it seems like, between your trips and then what I've seen on Instagram. So I remember the days not that long ago, a few years ago, where we'd be doing podcasts like this, and you'd be like, I don't think I'm going to get to hunt at all in October. and I'd throw a conniption. So I'm glad that's not the case anymore.
Right. Well, I mean, when it comes to Iowa, it's almost like I need to plan. You know how I plan the trip to Michigan, or I plan the trip to South Dakota. I need to just plan solid blocks of time away, like I am doing for this rut, to even just get into the timber close by. Just say, okay, 3 days. It's almost easier for me to disappear, and even if I just threw a tent in my backyard, than it is to come home every night.
I know exactly what you mean. I was just thinking, like, man, I of course love getting home to see the family and everything, but it does make it hard in a different kind of way. Sometimes you just kind of, if you can just, like you said, just kind of disappear for a while and focus on that thing, and they can focus on their thing, and then come back and be 100% there. But when you're like 70% not there, 30% there, it's almost worse sometimes, it seems like.
Yeah, that's a fact, man.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just going to preface our conversation today by saying that I might say things that don't make any sense. I might have run-on sentences. I might completely forget what we're talking about because I'm just drained, man. I'm drained. So I'll explain more about that momentarily. But already, I can't even find the words.
All right, so Mark can take a nap, and I'll finish up.
Yeah, could you do that for me? I've hunted 13 of the last 15 days. I just figured out, and a lot of mornings and all days and all that kind of stuff. So I'm kind of hitting a wall today. I hit a wall, but first we got to rewind because we haven't got to talk about your Michigan hunt on this podcast yet. And I'll send everyone to your show, to the Nine Finger Chronicles, for the full scoop. We covered it in detail. We talked a lot about your thoughts and what you thought about Michigan and my thoughts on Michigan versus Iowa and everything like that. And that was a good conversation. But can you give us like as we say here, the Cliff Notes version of how'd the hunt go and kind of now 2 weeks later, what your thoughts are on it for the folks that haven't heard that conversation yet?
Absolutely, man.
Did you kill a slammer?
No, I didn't. Did I see a slammer? Nope.
No.
Did I see one spike buck? Yep. Did he come in after dark, after shooting light? Yep. And that's pretty much how Michigan went for me.
Yeah. So you saw a few deer. Big takeaways on the experience?
Well, I tell you what, man. I know now, and this is just my view of it from where I sat. I know now why Michigan holds so many deer and why there's a good population of deer in Michigan, because the terrain and the vegetation that I was hunting was extremely thick and nasty. And to be honest with you, fun. I love doing that tiptoe creeping type of run and gun hunting into places that I've never been before. And it's almost like Michigan is one or two steps away from just like holding some monsters between the ag and between the thick cover that they have, man. It was fun.
Yeah, like we talked about the other day, we've definitely got the habitat, and there's little pockets where some big boys can get the age they need to get to that point. But there's other areas where there's lots and lots of hunters and not a lot of mature bucks, and et cetera, et cetera. You also talked about the deer behavior and how different you felt that was. Tell me about that. We got to expand on that a little bit, because they're a little different.
Yeah, so it's funny you brought this up now, because I just had a day where I saw like 13 does. What was it? Friday night, was it? It was either Friday night. Yeah, it might have been Friday night. And I went out, hung a tree stand, and I passed like a 140-ish 3-year-old. I felt he was 3.
He's a good-looking deer.
Good-looking deer, and he was he was chasing does, and he was grunting, and he was snort wheezing, and he was and all the other, there's all these does, and these does were just so relaxed, right? Like nothing is going to hurt me today. When compared to Michigan, the does weren't even in the field yet. They were in the thick cover, and they had anxiety. And it was just crazy. I mean, just the way they carried themselves is extremely different. The deer in Michigan it was almost like they were on point the entire time I saw them. And it wasn't like they would really just casually walk anywhere. It was almost like they would trot to a spot, stop, look around, get nervous, put their head down, force themselves to eat something, trot somewhere else, just completely different, man.
Perpetual paranoia.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's so funny that I sometimes just take that for granted as like how deer normally behave. So when you said that, it was like, oh yeah, it's not supposed to be like this all the time. But since you were here, I've noticed it even more. So on my Michigan hunts, I've just had so many times where these deer, these does just out of nowhere, they're looking up all around. I've never hunted in these trees before, and somehow they're looking up. Gosh, why can't I be somewhere else like Iowa where they don't do that? So many times I thought that. It's man, they are.
I'll tell you this. One thing that I thought was going to happen a lot more was I was going to get blown at in Michigan. Just whether it was entry routes or walking in, because I bumped some deer heading to some of my tree stands in the mornings, and none of them blew. And in Iowa, they would sit there and they'd blow at you, and they'll blow at you and blow at you. And I wonder if some of that has to do with, if you blow, you're giving away your position and you're going to die. So certain deer don't do that anymore.
Right. Yeah, I don't know about that. I know what you're saying. At the same time, though, I've certainly had deer in Michigan that will do the thing where they'll sit and blow forever. Like that happened to me a couple days ago, and was it a couple days ago? Yeah, a couple days ago, and this morning a little bit too. So yeah, it's hard to get away from, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So you had a good time. You didn't
fun,
get a
man.
deer. You got to see how the other side of the railroad tracks lives.
Yep.
You got a buck, actually.
Oh yeah.
You forgot to mention you did get a buck.
I never found him though.
With your quarter panel of the truck.
Right.
You totaled it too, didn't you? I saw that.
So,
jeez.
Well, it wasn't totaled in the fact that it did a shit ton of damage. It totaled it because the damage was worth more than my actual vehicle. So
it's saying more about the vehicle than the damage.
Right, exactly. So I took the cash payout, and I still drive the same truck. It just has some deer damage to the one side of it.
There you go. Okay. Well, gave you a little bit of a battle scar to remember the hunt by.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll always remember Michigan.
Okay. So you had your Michigan public land hunt. Soon after you left, I took off for Ohio, kind of impromptu. I had a few days where I didn't want to hunt my Michigan spots yet. So I thought, you know what? I'm just going to buy an Ohio tag and try some brand new stuff. Zero scouting, zero planning. Literally the night before, I'm like, I'm going to do it. So I will make this quick. I got a tag and I did some e-scouting of some spots up in the northern half of the state that were closer to where I live in Michigan. And I thought there's not as much public land up here as the South, and it's much smaller pieces. But maybe because of that, it's overlooked. Maybe everybody wants to go down south where all the public land is and where all the big giant bucks are. But these northern spots might be okay, and maybe there's not people hitting them because of that. And that was my idea, my theory. And I had 4 days to go in there and try to find something. And I was going to just scout until I found a pocket where there was lots of fresh sign and no hunters. And basically, it was 4 days of scouting without finding that until the very last day. But the weird thing about the public land down there that I found that I haven't experienced other places is that they have mowed. They've got like their conservation officers, God bless them, super nice guys, but they love to mow. So they've got brush cut trails to every corner, every part of every public parcel I went to. Every single one of them had trails everywhere, like roads everywhere. So there was nowhere that was hard to get to. Everything you could easily walk to. So every time I tried to get to some tough to get to place, there was always some way to get there easily walking, without needing to go through thick, nasty stuff. And because of that, there was hunter sign everywhere. So hit a bunch of spots. I don't know, like 5 different places, maybe more. Did a lot of hiking, did a lot of looking. On my last day, I found a good spot that didn't seem to have people going into it and found a bunch of sign, but then found a gut pile. So someone had been in there and had killed something. So that was basically my Ohio hunt. I'll try to get down to some other parts of the state later this year. But like you said, with your trip, it was good just to be somewhere new and hanging, hunting, exploring, no expectations, just learning and figuring stuff out as you go. So that was cool.
Yeah.
But no field tags. So that brings us to the rut then. So I hunted from like the 19th through the 23rd, 19th to the 23rd there, and then came right back and then had my chunk of time I could hunt here in my local spots in Michigan. I had like a 2-week window that I can hunt in Michigan for those main target bucks I have before I have to go to the back 40. I got to go to the back 40 for like 13 days. So I have to get my other stuff done before that. So that's what I've been doing since the 24th of October. But you've been out.
These pieces that you've been bouncing around on, are they public? Are they private? Or up in Michigan, are they like places you've hunted before? Why aren't you 100% focused on Tran?
I am.
Okay.
I've got a number of different small pieces in his neck of the woods that I've access to now.
Okay, I got you.
That's what I've been focusing on this period of time. I have some new access that I haven't had in the past. But yeah, so that's what I've been doing. And I can give you the real. Do you want to cover your hunts that you've been doing in Iowa? How many hunts have you had in Iowa this past couple weeks?
Oh man, like 1, 2, 3, 4. I think 5 in 2 weeks. I've 5 sits since I've been back in Iowa from Michigan.
Okay, so other than the one where you passed that big 140, are there any of note? Anything worth sharing?
Well, so that was the first morning hunt so I got out in evening. I went back to the same stand 2 or 3 days later for another evening hunt. Then the following morning, I went out again, and that's when I had my encounter with that first. I guarantee he was 4-year-old, 140, big body on him, 10-pointer, just it's real early. Kind of when that happened. So that was like the 28th or something like that. And just wasn't interested at that point at that. So
weren't interested.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
I wasn't interested at that buck because I haven't even made it down to my main farm yet. I still got a ton of trail cameras to check. But so I passed him at 25 yards. He came. My stand was right on the edge of a bedding area. So let's just say the bedding area was on top of this ridge and this kind of this flat area. I was off to the side where the wind was blowing through it, and he kind of walked not right down the center of it, but the 1/3 of it closer to me. And I had a real good pocket in there. He's 100% broadside at like 25 yards. Let him go. Saw another little, like a 2x2 or a 3x3, like a 6-pointer, real small. He came in as well that morning. I tore down, hung out the house for a while. And then on Friday, it would have been the 30th. I went back out and, run and gun hunt. I was going into this farm, and I'm talking scrape city, baby. Like scrapes almost under. I don't know if you ever walked into a property where there's scrapes under every tree that hangs over a field.
Yeah.
And that's not an exaggeration.
Jeez.
Literally, there was a scrape under every tree. And but I get in there to where I wanted to go. First, I checked some trail camera. Had on that particular farm, my number 1 and number 2 were both on that trail camera, but they were there at the middle of the night, right? So whatever. I decided I wanted to hunt in that area, but my wind was doing something real funky, kind of blowing into the timber where I thought these deer were going to go. So I bumped out of that, worked my way further down the field, and followed the sign into this little area of the cornfield where it turns into a pocket. It's almost like if you took a rectangle and then added a small half circle to some, one of the longer sides.
Yep.
That is where I hung up, and my wind was blowing right down into this gully, into the main valley, and kind of out into the bigger part of a different field. And it was kind of a risk that I needed to take, or it was not hunt that area, that farm at all. And I wanted to hunt, and I'm glad I did, because instantly before I was even done setting up, man, I had some does and that 3x3 again out in the field. And he started pushing some does around. Some more does started flooding into this field. And then I look over, to the east, and there's a buck I'd never seen before. I'd say a 135, 140 class, 8-pointer. He was either an 8 or a 9, and he had a split G2. And to be honest with you, I think I have his shed right over there on my table.
Nice.
From the previous year.
That's sweet.
So, yeah. So I passed him at 25 yards. He was dogging does all in front of me, putting on a show, snort wheezing and all that stuff. So he did that. And then I got out of there, couldn't hunt that next morning, couldn't hunt that next evening. And so I'm actually going back to that stand tomorrow, which will be the 3rd, November 3rd. But last night I got in my car, which would have been November 1st, and I couldn't hunt, and I had my boy with me. We'd go around and drive around the section, and I saw my number 1 crossing the road into the neighboring property that butts up against the field that I saw the action in the night before. So really? I know it's a couple days, away from when I'll actually get in there, but there's a good sign that tomorrow morning, I don't know, I might be able to, if nothing's in the field, I might be able to crack the antlers and pull something out of the timber.
Nice. So is tomorrow the beginning of full-blown rutcation?
Yep. So tomorrow morning I'm hunting around the house, just basically to tear down the tree stand and see if I can't make a miracle happen on this other farm. Then it's time to head down south, get to the main farm. First thing I'm doing is checking trail cameras. I'm pulling all my cards, checking all the data, and then really starting to get crazy. I mean, it's full bore at that point.
And do you have the full 2 weeks this year?
I have the hunt hard until there's been no date or time frame set.
Okay. So it's until you get that call.
It's until I get the call.
Yeah.
It's until my mother-in-law decides she wants to go home. But I just really hope I get it done early this year. I hope I connect with some of the deer that are around. I don't even know what's around, to be honest with you, because I haven't checked cards since September.
Man. So is the game plan this year any different than what we talked about this summer, or any different from the big things you've done on this property in past years? I mean, usually you're checking cameras pretty often, using those to kind of inform you where to focus. And then I know you had the whole Gnarly Charlie plan from last year. Where do you stand on all that now?
Yeah, so Gnarly Charlie has never showed this entire year thus far. I think the last time I had a picture of him was in January. He's a no-show in 2020, basically. This summer, nothing. I had a decent buck, just a one-time deal show up. I shouldn't say decent. He's definitely a shooter. Show up on cell cam. Was it 2 nights ago? Last night or 2 nights ago or something like that. And but he's in that cell cam's in a weird, awkward spot that I would only hunt when the corn was in that field. But I'm getting nothing except that one stray buck probably cutting through the property to get to a different piece. Anyway, no Gnarly Charlie. So that just straight up means that it's really anything that makes my heart jump at this point. I do have a couple of deer that when I checked my cards in September, I got a couple deer that are, I passed a beautiful 3-year-old last year. He's back as a probably close to 174-year-old. I would love to have an encounter with him at some point. Who knows? And other than that, let the cards tell me when I check them, or any deer that kind of gets me excited, to be honest with you.
Man.
Yeah.
You've got some bucks, dude. You've got some bucks.
But I will say this. I am going to fill the freezer. I bought an extra doe tag this year. So if I know a lot of people don't like to shoot does during November, but I think, man, with my freezer and the way I like to eat venison, it being empty, I'm going to lay down some meat too.
Yeah. If you got the empty freezer problem, you got to do that. So what's the game plan as far as that though? Like, are you going to shoot, like what doe are you going to shoot? Are you honestly going to shoot a random doe in the middle of a hunt while you're rut hunting? Or are you going to wait until you kill a buck first?
You know how this works, right? This is how it works. I say I'm going to do something. I'm going to fill my freezer, but then, I can't shoot that doe because who knows if she's hot. What's behind her? Why is she looking behind her? Oh my God, what's going on?
Her tail's flicking.
Yeah. So I might just shoot a couple button bucks, to be honest with you.
Well, you do whatever you got to do.
I know. So shoot, or maybe a real young doe who probably isn't going to breed this year. Who knows? It's all going to be, I say all these things, but every year I shoot from the hip. And that's the only thing that I can say I know I'm going to do is shoot from the hip.
You know what? That sounds about right, Dan. If there's anything consistent about you, it's that you're going to shoot from the hip.
No plan.
Oh, I love it.
But I'm jacked, man. Good. I'm freaking jacked. The warm weather, though, is going to kind of throw me for a loop. But
yeah, that is a bummer coming up here, huh?
Yeah. But they're still going to breed, man. So you still got to hunt.
Well, I'll tell you what. Ever since 2015, I think it was, last time I drew my Iowa tag, I hunted in Iowa, and a warm spell came through. I was hunting for a few days, was on some deer, and then I saw like 2 days of like hot weather, like 70s or something. And I thought, it's going to be lousy. I'm just going to go back to Michigan for a couple days and get some brownie points and do some stuff. Then I'll come back when the weather cools down again. Well, those 2 days when I was gone, 3 of my friends all killed big bucks in Iowa on the hot days. And that was just like the reminder that it's the rut. Anything's possible. Who cares about the weather? Don't miss it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Biggest 8-point deer I've ever had an encounter with came through on the hottest day on November 4th, like, I don't know, a handful of years ago. This is a giant, mature, big, gorgeous 8-pointer. And that was one of those encounters where it's like, hey man, you're not supposed to be moving right now, right? It's 75 degrees outside. Why are you moving? You're not supposed to, because I read that somewhere.
Right.
So don't let anybody who doesn't hunt your property tell you how to hunt. just go hunt.
Yeah, man. There's nothing more important than those hormones, the testosterone, the estrogen, those deer. They don't care if it's hot, cold, whatever. They want to breed. So
yeah. And there's one more big thing that's going down on, let's see, Thursday.
What's that?
I turned 40.
Whoa. 40.
Fucking 40, Mark.
Whoa.
Yeah. I don't know if I need to bring oxygen into the stand with me.
Yeah,
take out a life insurance policy.
Do you take a walker in there with you? Holy smokes. We're going to have wheelchair accessible tree stands for you next year.
I'm going to be that guy. I shouldn't even make the joke, but those tree stands that have the automatic lift up into the air?
Yeah, that's you pretty soon.
Yeah.
Man, well, happy birthday.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Time's flown.
Yep.
You don't look a day over, I don't know.
Don't say it. Don't say it, because I'll come back at you with the Rookie of the Year.
I know it. I named a buck Rookie of the Year, by the way.
This year?
Yeah, this year. Kind of.
Nice.
There's a buck that's just a stud. I think it's a 2-year-old. And when I say stud, a stud for Michigan is a 2-year-old. Yeah. And I'm like, man, he's the best new deer I've seen around here. And I was like, yeah, I'll call him Rookie of the Year.
Does he have a sweet goatee?
He's a dashing baby face. He's a 10-pointer. I don't know. I mean, maybe 115, 120, 120, somewhere like that.
Nice.
Maybe also 125. I don't know. For Michigan, that's a dang good 2-year-old. So if he can make it through the Orange Army, he'll be a stud in a couple of years. So yeah,
well, you're in a place that consistently gets deer.
Yeah,
a handful of deer to an older age class, man.
Yep, every year 1 or 2 of them make it through. So hopefully it stays that way.
I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
Okay. So you were bouncing around on some property recently, and I was following you on an Instagram, one of your Instagram stories.
Yep.
And did you honestly set up 10 yards or 15 or 20 yards away from another hunter without knowing it?
Okay. So
I got to hear this story.
I totally forgot about that one. Okay. So you're just about to start your rutcation, and I'm almost done with mine. Because like I mentioned, I've got to start hunting on the back 40 on November 7th. So all of my hunts for Tran in the rut had to precede that. So from the 24th and on, I've been hunting, and basically, and this will lead me to the story you just asked about. Basically, my game plan was for the early part of that period, I was going to circle around the outside edges of his core areas and bedding areas that he spends the most time in historically, and based on what the wind would let me do, get in between food and his bedding, and then just kind of rotate around these core spots. And with some new access I got recently, I'm able to hunt a little more of these areas than I used to. So I was pretty excited about that. But, basically the first handful of days, saw a lot of activity, saw young bucks, but didn't see Tran. I caught a little brief glimpse at him one night, made a move in there after him the next day, didn't see him. But eventually I got this wind to hunt right in between a just cut cornfield and his best bedding area, the spot that I just knew he was in there, but I hadn't been able to hunt there because of wind. So finally I got the wind I needed. I'm 4 days in or 5 days into this period of time where I've been rotating around and seeing plenty but not seeing him yet. And so was really excited to get to this spot because I knew that was the number one food source right now. Because what I should bring up is that the main farm that I hunt the most in this area got disked under. All the crop fields got disked under this year. So for the first time in a decade, there's zero food on the main farm. So what's usually, 60 acres of beans or corn is now dirt. So that really changes how deer use this entire area. So it's really thrown me for a loop as far as deer patterns. Everything's different. So everything from all my previous years is different now. So because of this one cut cornfield that I could hunt close to was the major draw now, since there was nothing else in this zone. I could finally hunt it, and it was cold and rainy. So I slipped in, sneaking my way in. It's raining, and there's just sign everywhere. The most fresh scrapes I've seen anywhere around this property, the biggest rubs I've seen anywhere on the property this year. I'm like, this is it. This is where he's been coming into. No one's been hunting up here. I was excited. I thought, I'm going to kill him. So I slipped in there, really took my time thinking about finding the right tree where I could hunt and, have my wind just safe enough, but also be in a position where I'd be able to get a shot still, being close to the edge of the cover. Fast forward, I don't know, an hour into the sit, and the wind starts shifting a little bit, and the wind dies down, and then starts kind of, that feeling where it's you throw your milkweed or something, and you're like, ugh, don't go any more that direction. And then 5 minutes later, you throw the milkweed again, like, oh no, please no. And then a little bit later, it's like right, it's gonna go right to the edge of that bedding, and I'm sitting there bouncing back and forth in my mind. I'm thinking, man, this is the spot of spots, but if I'm blowing my wind into the bedding area, what's the point of being in the spot of spots? So I sat there for a couple minutes, like going back and forth, and finally I decided, you know what? I have to pull the plug. I'm not going to blow this thing out so early when I know it's a great setup and there's no one else in here messing things up, I didn't think. And then just as I'm thinking I'm going to do it, I'm going to pull down and get out of here before I do too much damage, I hear kapow! And I about jump out of my socks, and I knew that sound right away. It was a crossbow. And I'm thinking, that was like right next to me. Someone just shot a crossbow right next to me. And I spin around, and I look, and I'm hunting about 40, 50 yards off of that cut cornfield inside the timber towards that bedding area I was talking about. But that cornfield is another neighbor's property. And there was a guy hunting that property right on the edge. And he basically shot a deer that was right on the edge there, 40 yards from me. And I had no idea he was in there because it had been pouring rain. And so he must have slipped in from the other side in the rain, and I had been set up looking the opposite way the whole time. I never heard him. He climbed up in his ladder stand. He never knew I was there. And that was that. So the wind had shifted. He shot a deer go running all over the place. And then I'm sitting there and I'm realizing this guy, and I know the guy. He doesn't worry about wind or scent control or anything like that. So I'm thinking, okay, he's certainly not going anywhere. He's going to sit here, blow into here the whole night. So rather than me walk out of here and create more damage and blow my wind in somewhere else, I guess this is a sunk cost. So I waited it out, and it was a bad night. Deer blowing, a few other deer. I almost filmed him shoot another deer. But I see this doe walking out to the field. I'm like, oh no, you're in trouble. Be careful, be careful. And she got smart and turned around. But that's kind of just been the story of this year. I'm having a year, Dan, where it just seems like if it can go wrong, it is going wrong. I mean, that whole Idaho public land trip, people have heard me lament about that, had a lot of stuff go wrong on that hunt. My Ohio public land hunt was just like people, tree stands, walking around trying to find somewhere. And now here, that happened when I thought I was in the spot of spots. And then I pulled out of there, said, all right, we're just going to keep grinding at it. And then we had 3 other notable things that have happened since that, Dan.
Okay.
So I kept circling around these core areas, hitting what I can with the wind, and kind of progressively tightening, getting a little bit further in. So if you can envision a couple of these core bedding areas and like a target around them. And each time I'm rotating around the target based on wind, but then also getting a little bit deeper into the core. And every day I've been doing that, except adjusting off of sightings or different things like that. So the 3 most exciting things that have happened started on the 30th of October. I got set up, moved in really tight to one of the bedding areas that I think he uses, and got set up in a place I've never hunted before, right on the edge, and I'm not set up for, I don't know, an hour. When I catch something way off across the way, I can kind of see through this open timber to another brushy spot, and in this other brushy spot, I see Tran, and I see him with a doe, and he's like locked on the doe. You know that look when they're not chasing, they're not like he's with that doe. She kind of takes a few steps. He steps up behind her, like he's locked on a doe. And they're walking away towards a crop field, the opposite direction from where I'm at. So in this moment, I realized, okay, there's an hour and a half of daylight left. They're going the other direction, and I know where that doe is going. There's no food behind me. The only place she's going to go is out in that direction. So I think to myself, there's a decent bit of wind right now. I'm going to go get that buck. I'm not going to sit here and dick around. I'm going to get that damn deer. I'm sick of dicking around. I'm sick of hunting this deer for 3 years now. I want to kill this thing. I'm going to make something happen. So I've never done this before, but I got out of my tree stand and stalked these deer down on foot. And I followed them out to this area, and then I knew where they're going. And so I was able to try to cut them off. But just before I was able to kind of get to the point where I thought I could cut them off, the wind died down. And I couldn't see them anymore, but I knew they were somewhere up near the edge of this crop field. And I was, if we're imagining direct, they're north of me somewhere. And I figured about 200 yards, 150 yards north of me somewhere. And then we've got crop fields to my west. There's a crop field, then there's one of these dirt fields, and then there's one of my little food plots that I have on one of these properties. And I think to myself, okay, there's no way I can get any closer now because the wind completely died down. We're down to like the last half hour or something of daylight, and it's still, I'm in really crunchy grass, and I can't move much. So at this point, I realized probably my best bet is I'm not going to beat him to the crop field, but I have seen on some of these other hunts I'd done earlier in the week, many of the deer, this surprised me, many of the does that I saw go out to one of this cornfield, they would feed in the cornfield for a while, and then they would drop south, walk across the dirt field all the way to my little green food plot. And every night this was happening. A good number of does would leave the corn, go across the dirt, and come down to my food plot. So I thought, maybe she'll do the same thing. Maybe she'll come out to the corn, he'll follow her to the corn, and then after fiddling around for 15 minutes, she'll walk down the edge and come to the food plot. If she does that, I could intercept that. I could slip down towards the edge of the dirt field and the food plot. And there's a creek that runs through there, and almost every time anything comes by, they cross in this one section. So I was able to creep a little bit further that direction so that I could be within shooting range of that creek crossing, which would, I don't know, I was like 50 yards inside off of the food plot into the cover where this crossing is. And I got set up. And lo and behold, not soon after getting set up, here pops out a doe over the hill into the dirt field and Tran right behind her. And they start coming my way. And now it's like 10 minutes left of daylight, and I'm in position. I'm thinking, man, if she comes here to the corner just like they do, I'm going to get a shot. And so I'm all getting into position, and I really can't move anymore. And they're getting closer and closer. Now it's 5 minutes left, and they're at like 90 yards. Now there's like 3 minutes left, and they're at 70 yards. And they came all the way in, but instead of coming to my corner, they stayed out in the dirt field and crossed into the food plot maybe 60, 70 yards out away from me, and after shooting light anyways. So really intense, exciting hunt, but didn't come together. But it was awesome to see him, and awesome that it kind of worked, sort of, at least partially. But
did you make that move for a reason? That doesn't sound like something that you would normally do.
Yeah, I would not normally do that, except right when there's a buck locked on a doe like that. From my experience, there's nothing that's going to pull him away. I've tried over the years trying to grunt at these deer. I've tried to do things like that, and that's not going to pull him away. Like, that buck is on that doe, and it wasn't like he was chasing the doe. They weren't chasing. She was like with him. So it wasn't like they were going to run all over the place. It was like she was walking a few steps. He was right behind her. They'd stand there for a few minutes. She'd walk a few steps. He'd stand there for a few minutes. So I knew, I've seen this happen so many times. I've seen this happen in past years. Like when I was hunting that buck Frank, this is what happened. He had a doe locked down, and I knew they stayed in the same area for 3 days. He would just follow her around like a zombie. And so in this case, I knew that Tran, the zombie buck, was going to walk to this corn. I knew that's where that doe was going to go because that's where all these deer go to right now. And there was no way that I was going to get a shot. And he's the only deer I want to kill. So I could either sit 400 yards away while the only deer I want to kill is going the other direction. I could sit there for 3 hours and twiddle my thumbs, or I could go do something about it. And that's kind of where I'm at. There were a couple other bucks on camera earlier in the year that I would shoot if they gave me an opportunity, but nothing's been showing up at all. So there's Tran or bust, and I only have a handful of days to try to get him killed before I got to take off. And I don't know. I'm just getting to the point now where I don't know. I'm not going to sit around and wait anymore. I got to try to make something happen.
You have to.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it kind of sucks, to be honest with you, that you got this target buck. It's a class buck for Michigan, and you have other quote unquote priorities that are going to pull you away from this.
And I'm not complaining about the upcoming hunt in the back 4. It's gonna be awesome. It's gonna be fun. I'm excited about it. But as far as trying to kill my target buck, it definitely throws a wrench into it. So the whole spot and stalk thing happens, doesn't quite come together. But I know that he's on that doe, and they're gonna be here again tomorrow. At least from my experience, when I've seen a buck locked on a doe in this area, he's just gonna hang close. So the next day, I slipped into the same general area. Got in there to where I thought the wind would be okay, did a big circle around. This is very similar to how I was hunting Frank 3 years ago. Like he was in there locked around with a doe. I would circle around, try to get in front of him, expecting them to come back into one of these bedding areas. And I did that on this hunt, and they basically did what I thought, but instead of coming in where I was, they came in several hundred yards ahead of me, or farther to the north of me. So I saw him with the doe again, and they slip into some bedding cover to my north and then disappear. Then about 10 a.m., I catch a glimpse of him again into a little further in the cover. So now they're up in this cornfield area. That's where they came in from. So I'm thinking, okay, they're on the northern section. I'm betting she's going to come back out into that corn. So I pulled out midday, did a big circle up to the northern section of these properties, got up in there, got set up, and had a whole plan in place where I thought, man, they're going to do one of two things. They're in this bedding pocket. I saw them at about 10 a.m. I was set up if they came the north route to get to the fields, which they'd done the night before. But I also had like a raised berm that was running a little ways away from me, about 50, 60 yards away from me. And if they came out on the other side of that, which was the other thing I thought was possible, I decided, you know what, if they come out there and if they're just moseying like they have been, I'm going to get out of the tree and do the same damn thing. I'm going to get down there, and it was windy. I'll sneak up to the edge of the berm and get a shot when they come down at the point. Had this whole plan in place, and they didn't show up that night. So that was day 2 of interest. Now, fast forward 2 days later, I hunt the next day and don't have any encounters with him. I decide that I had a specific wind direction that would allow me to hunt what I call the belly of the beast. This is a spot that I have not been able to hunt in the past, but now I can. It's kind of one of the primo bedding spots. And there's a tree in the middle of this section that I've always looked at, and I've seen more deer pass by this tree, more bucks pass by this tree than any other. But it just seems impossible to hunt. I just don't know how you hunt it without deer winding you. But I thought, okay, I'm down to only 4 days left before I have to go. And it's our last cold day before this warm spell hits. And with this wind I have today, this is today as we speak, this happened today. With this wind direction I have, it will blow right along a creek. If I sit in this tree right on the edge of the creek, I could blow my wind. If it goes the way it's supposed to be forecasted, it'll blow almost right down the creek. And that's probably my best option. Deer could still wind me, but it's the least of all the dangers. So today I woke up at 3:30. I got in there 2.5 hours before daylight. I hung a set up in this tree, got all set up. I'm in the middle of it. I'm shooting my shot, basically was the plan. This was it. I'm swinging for the fences. This is my home run sit, going into the middle of it, and it's either I'm going to kill him or I'm going to blow everything out of it. And daylight's starting to crack, and I hear chuk, 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 and Tran is walking right to the bottom of my tree, Dan.
What?
And he comes in at 10 yards, 10 minutes before shooting light. And he walks 10 yards, perfect shot, and then comes all the way down to the downwind side and busts me and blows out of there. Yeah. If he had come 10 minutes later, I would have smoked him at 10 yards.
And it's just too early to shoot.
Yeah. Can't shoot. So,
that sucks, man.
Yeah, man, it was devastating. It worked perfect. I'd done everything right. My buck's there, and I can't shoot him. And then he goes downwind, blows out, bounds off, blows once, and then kind of jogs off the other direction. But here's where it gets crazy. I'm bummed out, but I'm thinking, well, there it is. He's not coming back through here again. And then now it's daylight, and I look up and I see him again. He's now a couple hundred yards away with a doe. Over the next hour and a half, all chaos broke loose around me. There was a hot doe, and he was chasing that doe all around, fighting off other bucks, and multiple times looked like he was going to come back within range. A doe came squirting towards me, and he was coming on a beeline right to me. That doe was coming right to me with Tran right behind her. I was clipped on, ready to draw back. He was at 70, coming in towards 60, and then she squirted away and went the other way. And that happened several times. And then finally they disappeared.
So you had 2 encounters with him in the same day, but that doe led him away?
Yeah.
Did a doe come through the first time, or was it him by himself?
He was by himself first thing. First thing in the morning, he was by himself cruising. And then he was chasing does after that. And so that was the second time I saw him.
Dang.
So he's chasing does. I thought it was going to happen again, but then doesn't. They disappear in the timber. Now, like 2 hours later, I catch sight of him again on the complete opposite side of me, cruising through this other section of timber. It's like, okay, I'm back in the game. Maybe this could happen again. He's cruising, then disappeared. And then nothing. And then around 11 o'clock, I see another deer crossing the creek. And the creek is where my wind's blowing. And I see antlers. And I spin, look down there, and at 190 yards, he's right in the creek, staring at me, right in my wind, for the second time that day. And he stood there for at least a minute, just staring a hole in me. And I can't tell you how big his neck is, Dan. His neck is like an oak trunk. I mean, it was monstrous. I just looked at him, and we just stared at each other for a minute. And I'm thinking 2 things. I'm like, he's monstrous, and he has me pegged so bad. and he just stared, and then finally just jogged off. And that was it. That was my day.
Dang.
Yeah.
Like, close, man. And
Yeah.
that's bow hunting in a nutshell, isn't it?
Yeah, man, it
Like,
is.
Sometimes you get them, sometimes you don't, man.
That's the truth. That is the truth. Today was, I don't know. I've hit a wall a little bit as far as exhaustion, and then just kind of disheartened with this whole thing. Like I swung for the fences and I did my thing and just did not come together. And now I kind of feel I don't know what to do now. I kind of blew that spot, and so I guess I'm just going to keep on keeping on for these last couple days. But I'm a little bit at a loss. I don't know.
Yeah, well, you know just as well as I do, it takes one hot doe.
Yeah, yes, it's true.
Dude, one hot doe is all you need. And dude, I've been there before. I've killed a deer with my deer last year. Hot doe right in front of me. Buck came in, shot him.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of what I have to do now is just try to be in the zone, be in the area of interest, and hope for the right doe to come through. Because I've kind of tried my tricks, and I've tried to circle around the different spots and try to predict where he's going to be. And he's always over here, and I'm there, and he's here. Or doe takes him here, and I go over there. So I'm just going to keep on trying and try to stay positive and try to stay focused and give her hell, Dan. I'm just going to give her hell. So
go get him.
That's what I'm going to do.
Don't give up, Mark.
I won't. I'm telling you, though, this 3:30 a.m. wake-up call tomorrow is going to come way too soon.
3:30?
Yeah.
How early are you getting in the stands?
Well, I got to try to very quietly slip in there, which takes a long time, and then hang a set in the dark.
Oh, hanging the set in the dark.
Yeah.
That's probably the worst.
Yeah. You'd be proud of me, though. I've been a run and gun machine this year. I've sat a regular tree stand like 2-3 times out of the last 13 days or something like that. So, yeah, man, I've been up and down, up and down, up and down. So,
Well,
yeah.
Good luck, brother.
Thanks, man. That's my rut story so far. I can't wait to hear your rut stories coming up. I'm sure you'll have some good hunts coming here soon, and
yeah, man.
I wish you good luck. And your reminder was a good one.
Yeah, I'm opposite of you, man. I am energized. I am ready to go. I'm fired up. There's not 1 ounce of exhaustion in me at this point. And like I tell you every year, man, I get more sleep when I go to my rut vacation than I do at home anyway. So,
well, enjoy your sleep, enjoy your rest and relaxation. I know you're gonna be working though. I know the grind is gonna happen for you too. So, yeah, man. What we have the rest of the show is some good info. Greg Clements and Aaron Warbritton from the Hunting Public. So that's the end of our recap. Let's get into some great know-how from these guys. Hopefully between these stories and the information they're going to share, all of you listening can have some exciting rut hunts coming soon.
Hey everybody, listen up. I got mega huge news. Meat Eater Live is heading back out on the road. That's right. Join me and the crew. Clay Newcomb, Cal, Yanni, Spencer's going to be there. Phil the engineer's going to be there. Meat Eater Live headed back out. Now, when you get every ticket, okay, every ticket you buy, you get a signed copy of our new Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook. This tour is celebrating the release of the book. Buy a ticket, get a signed copy, Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, camp stove, and campfire, which I'll point out is a $38 value. Here's where we're going to go. April 23rd, the Mesa Arts Center in Mesa, Arizona. April 24, the Balboa Theater in San Diego. April 25, the Grove in Anaheim, California. April 27, the Crest Theater in Sacramento. April 29, the Union in Salt Lake City. April 30, the Egyptian in Boise. May 1, the Wilma Theater in Missoula. May 2, the Bing Crosby Theater in Spokane, Washington. May 4, Revolution Hall in Portland, Oregon. And May 5, the last day of the tour, Pantages Theater in Tacoma, Washington. For tickets and more information, visit the events page at themeateater.com. Hope to see you at the show.
All right. I'm excited to have on the line with us here Aaron Warbritton and Greg Clements from the Hunting Public. Guys, thank you for taking the time to do this right now.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, Mark. Pleasure to be here.
I gotta believe, and I know from following stuff on YouTube and everywhere, that you're crazy busy right now. Where are you guys right now? I know you're in different places, but where are you and where are you heading in the coming days? Greg?
Currently, I'm sitting here in Iowa and just working on editing. Yesterday morning, shot a nice buck, so we're all tagged out here in Iowa. Our crew, everybody that had a resident archery tag is tagged out. So it's kind of a strange situation to be in. Normally this time of the year, we're grinding it out in the stand, going hunting all day long. But yeah, we're we're just in editing mode now.
That's pretty nice.
Yeah, it's a good problem to have, I guess. Just kind of feel lost, not feeling like I need to get out to the woods and go hunt, but get some editing done, and then we'll be off to a different state so soon enough.
What about you, Aaron?
I'm in Missouri at the moment, and I've been filming Ted off and on all week, but it's just been crappy weather. It's been just nonstop rain for like 3.5, 4 days now. So And I've just been going back and forth, kind of filming him and then going home for, an evening or so to dry everything off. And then I was on my way back down there this morning to film him. But, it just quit raining where he's hunting at. So he's headed to the woods this afternoon. It ain't raining where I'm at, though. It's still raining here. So we're trying to kill one in Missouri right now before we head to Tennessee next week. But it's definitely been pretty wet.
Yeah.
So that's throwing a wrench in things.
Bummer. Well, Greg, are you able to share this story, or do you guys have to hold on to it for the video to hear about what happened yesterday?
No, I don't think so. The video should come out next week sometime. So I would say it's fairly timely, actually. It's one of, this last week of October has been really cool here in the Midwest. There's been, scraping activities ramped up. There's all kinds of sign in the woods. And as soon as I got back from Pennsylvania, we did the Public Land Challenge there. Kind of my goal coming into this last week of the season before we moved on to a different state was try to kill a buck over a decoy here in Iowa. And that's one of probably my favorite deer hunting tactic, honestly, because that's what I did mostly growing up in eastern Nebraska. Hunted a lot of open country, properties just with small patches of cover and are largely crop or pasture or something like that. So decoys were a huge advantage in that kind of open country. And, between my dad and my brother and I, my cousin, all our crew that hunted around there, one of us or more of us probably killed, a buck over a decoy every year there, growing up bow hunting back in Nebraska. So that's, since I'd moved to Iowa, I really hadn't hunted a whole lot with the decoy. And that's something that was kind of my goal for this season, was to get that done, and had a perfect opportunity yesterday morning.
What's the setup? What specifically, I guess, number one, how were you set up as far as where your stand was? And then number two, I'm really curious on the decoy placement and wind and all that.
Yeah. So the setup was actually plan B. The first spot that we went to, it was a spot that Aaron and I hunted last year, had an encounter with a big 9-pointer, and, wanted to go back in there and try to make that work. But the cover, the vegetation had grown up. Last year it was short brome grass, and this year it was Indian grass and blue stem. It was just tall, so that visual advantage wasn't there. It was just too thick. So Ethan and I got back to the truck, and I started pondering, thinking about other spots that would work. And the spot came to mind that was it's kind of a long ridge that's old cattle pasture. It's overgrown. It's a lot of cedars and thick bedding, thick draws on both sides of the ridge. And my thought was it'd be a good spot with high visibility, because there's, this ridge kind of bends around where there's visibility in a couple different directions. So you got the visual advantage. And then also, with it being a relatively calm morning, I figured, I had the rattling antlers, I figured we could call down into into these thick draws and into that thick cedar bedding and hopefully pull something up out of there. So we got set up. It was probably right at sunrise. It was, we got in there a little bit late because the first spot didn't pan out, but got in there. And as we were walking in, we had about a 300-yard walk in from the road. It was, actually easy access. And then I guess another thought I had is because it was dead calm that morning, I wanted to get in somewhere that it could get in quietly and just not blow everything out. So that worked out well. And as we were walking in, we started seeing a bunch of fresh rubs, that were, the peelings were on top of the leaves. The bark was still green, or the rub itself was still green, or I think Dan Infalt called it bleeding. They were just that fresh. So anyways, a bunch of fresh rubs, bunch of fresh scrapes. And so we were encouraged, going back in there that, there was a buck that was actively in that area. So got set up and took a few minutes to get set up, and was thinking about the best way to position the decoy so that it could be seen, as far as possible, kind of in both directions where there was visibility down this long ridge and then where the ridge bent around. So we were kind of set up in the corner there, and the wind was blowing our scent back into some thick cover behind us. So my thought was that, a lot of times with calling, a buck is going to try to circle in downwind and sometimes bust you, but he would have had to have gone into that really thick cover to get downwind of us. So it just seemed like it was making a lot of sense right there. And did the first calling sequence at 8 o'clock. It was just dead calm at that point in the morning. Nothing came of that. We really weren't seeing a lot of deer movement. And the morning was relatively slow. And then the wind started to pick up a little bit about 8:30, 9 o'clock. Had a 2-year-old buck come in. And the morning just had a better feel to it with that breeze blowing. And about 9:15, did a second calling sequence and set the antlers down and had a GoPro rolling behind us. I was able to see exactly how long it took from the time we stopped calling to the time the buck responded. And it was a minute and 15 seconds later, all of a sudden, a big 10-pointer popped his head up over the ridge and is 40 yards away looking at the decoy.
Wow.
So I told Ethan, big buck right here, don't move. And he was looking at the decoy, but his line was also, looking in our direction. So we tried to, slowly get in position and get ready. Ethan was kind of behind me. He had to get out around me to be able to film the deer. And he bristled up and started working left to the point where I thought maybe he was going to try to circle downwind, and it was going to be tougher for me to shoot to the left. My best shooting opportunity was to the right. So the buck is about 35 yards, kind of in some thick cover. And, I was afraid it was just going to fall apart, that he was going to hook around to the left and just wasn't going to get a shot opportunity. And then all of a sudden he broke back to the right and started looping around the backside of the decoy and came into it, bristled up. And again, I guess one of the downfalls to using a decoy sometimes, if they don't come in just right, and if they go in and bulldoze it, knock it over, a lot of times, your opportunity will fall apart there. But yeah, he came in and did right, kind of bristled up next to it and gave me a broadside shot at 23 yards and sent one through him, and he bounded 30 yards and fell over.
Man, that's awesome.
So, yeah. So it was an exciting hunt. It was nice when, a plan comes together, you kind of draw it up in your mind and it works out that way. Yeah. And he came out of one of those thick draws that I was referring to earlier. Yeah. And that was,
I always assume, and you talk to some people, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that being someone who hunts, somewhere like Michigan, heavily pressured deer, yada, 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 I'm so paranoid about ever trying something like a decoy because I feel like, there's no way that could work where there's so many hunters and so much stuff going on. But I know you guys are doing it on public land with quite a bit of success over the years. Is that something that you've seen? I know it has worked for you in Iowa. Has that worked for you in other states where there's more pressure? Have you tried it on any of these other different states you've been to and found it to be able to work too?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of where else that we've used it other than my home state where I did use it on public land there successfully. Private land that was, the shared permission with other people. I wouldn't call anything. The public land was fairly heavily pressured, I guess I would say. And
I used them in Missouri too. And had success down there on what I would call more heavily pressured lands. And I don't know, it's just speculation because I don't think we have much experience with decoys past those areas, but I think worrying too much about hunting pressure can be sort of overthinking it sometimes because we used to do the same thing. But all these areas that we go, when a deer gets in that, I guess what I'm trying to say is when they get in that mindset, when they're rutting, when they're acting aggressive, testosterone is up, you can get away with a heck of a lot more. I mean, Zach last year in New York killed a very, very mature buck in the middle of the rut with a doe on extremely heavily pressured lands. And he pretty much just walked up to the thing and shot it. I mean, literally just walked into the field and eventually the deer ran and walked right by him. Jeez. And I think in that situation, a decoy would have worked. And I would assume he would agree, would have worked, just as well in that situation as it would in Iowa or anywhere else for that matter. Whenever you start talking about the rut and bucks, especially mature bucks, because like that's their purpose this time of year, is they get super territorial, and it's time to start thinking about breeding does, regardless of where you're at. That can work extremely well.
Yeah.
In certain situations, obviously,
right.
Because that's all it comes down to. Deer hunting so situational everywhere you go. But
something I feel like you guys have done a really good job of is testing assumptions and proving them wrong. If you were to look at what you guys have done over the last few years and trying so many things that other folks might assume would be taboo on public land or not possible on public land or crazy or too aggressive, and by just trying these things and finding out that, oh yeah, it actually can work, it's really changing the game for a lot of people. Is there anything else like that during the rut that you guys have found where, 10 years ago you would have thought, oh, there's no way you could get away with that, but now today you're realizing, oh, that's not the case, and it's changed things for you? Does anything else come to mind like that?
I would say being super aggressive in the rut, and that's not to say. I guess we could get pretty far down the rabbit hole here. So stop me, Mark, if I get going too long.
You go for it.
But I think there's kind of two different tactics that work extremely well in the rut. One is sitting long hours in a specific spot, a funnel or a transition, whatever, and basically waiting for a buck to walk by. That is proven over time to be extremely effective. If you have the time and you can spend it as many full days in the woods as possible, you can kill bucks doing that. But what we've done more of in the last probably 6-7 years is we've actually started to move to find the action in the rut, literally walking or driving until we either see or spook, run into, whatever, the action. And what I mean by the action is a hot doe, a group of bucks in a certain location, because that's what I believe is going on a lot of the time. Most of the bucks are in one specific location for most of the rut. Sorry, I should back up. Most of the bucks on a given day are in a spot on a property. Wherever that doe is at that is coming into heat, most of the bucks in that area are going to be right there. And obviously we know that all that can get flipped upside down. It can change in a matter of seconds if they push her out of there or whatever. But I feel like that's something that has worked tremendously well for us, is being, especially on limited time. And I should preface by saying that if you don't have a lot of time in the rut, if you don't have the luxury of sitting in a funnel area all day long for day after day after day after day, I would recommend trying to literally walk around until you run into the deer. Even if that means spooking the deer, because if a doe's in heat and there's multiple bucks in that area, more times than not, we don't see them react the same way to pressure as we would other times of the year, because their main focus is, obviously breeding during that time. And I feel like if you just have a weekend, for example, or maybe you just have a couple days vacation and you're not in that action, maybe you're sitting in a pile of sign, you're sitting in an excellent funnel area, but if the hot doe is on the other side of the property for that 2 or 3 days, you're probably going to, watch a lot of squirrels and leaves blowing. But if you get down and you actually go and find the deer, you can have success a lot faster in the rut. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. How do you know when you found it, though? I mean, I realize there's a few obvious things, but I got to believe there's a little bit of... It probably has taken some experience to figure out the nuance of, oh, this is it, I need to stop right now, versus, okay, I just bumped a deer, but, maybe I should keep going. How do you know when you're in the spot where, okay, we're here, it's time?
A variety of different things. It's all situational, but I'll give you a couple of examples. One is scrapes. And I know you've heard it over and over again, don't pay attention to scrapes during the rut, but a lot of times scrapes are positioned in locations where numerous trails intersect, or even on the edges of bedding areas, or in transitions in between bedding areas. So if and I'll just bring up a specific example because that's the best way I can explain this.
Mm-hmm.
We were headed in on November 9th a couple years ago into a big block of woods, and we covered probably 3/4 of a mile down this ridge. There's lots of rubs in there, a decent amount of sign, but nothing like super, super fresh. We dove off of a point of the ridge, got on a long secondary ridge that fall off into a creek bottom that's pretty thick. And as we got down there, we started noticing, like, here's a really, really fresh scrape that was just worked. And then boom, here's another really, really fresh scrape that was just worked. I mean, I'm talking in the last 24 hours. So we popped up in a tree set up over it. And as we were hanging the stand, a mature buck pushed a doe by us at 10 yards, and we weren't ever able to kill it because we had the camera and the bow at the bottom of the tree and whatever. But what ensued after that was about, I think there was 4 or 5 different bucks on that ridge and in that immediate area, all vying for that doe. And a lot of those satellite bucks, you know, the younger bucks that didn't have the doe, they were rubbing, scraping, sparring, doing all sorts of aggressive behavior in and around where that buck had the doe. And I think that's where a lot of that fresh scraping activity had come from. But that's the sign that we set up on in that particular instance to get on that scenario. We've also just been gomming through the woods and literally just ran into a doe and a buck and jumped them. And literally had the buck that was with the doe separate them. The buck that was with the doe come back through there within 15 minutes looking for her. Blowing. I mean, he was alert. He knew we were in there, but he lost her when we bumped into him, and he was bound and determined to find her again. And the next day in that same spot, just a little bit deeper, it was just total chaos because, you know, we bumped them and she went probably 200-300 yards, stopped, settled down, and didn't leave the area completely. That's not always the case. I mean, it can change, like I said, very, very quickly. But if you're just moving around with your eyes up and you're looking for that out in front of you, and then reacting to it as you run into deer like that, like heading in deeper after them, I think you're going to get on to more action, especially in a short time frame.
Yeah. Greg, would you add anything to that or bring up anything different?
No, I'd say Aaron hit it pretty well. It seems like there's certain areas where we tend to find bucks with the hot doe, and it seems to revolve around some kind of physical barrier, water. A lot of times, if you have water in the area, whether it be a lake or a river, you know, sometimes you see them pushed up against a county road or something like that. It just seems like Aaron's referring to, driving around or walking around until you find the action. You know, a lot of times it's just simply driving around and checking out this public land, and then you just see the action from the road. You know, last year, I think in one particular day, Aaron and I drove around in the morning. It was a dead calm morning. Found a buck that had multiple bucks that had a hot doe pushed up against the county road, and we tried to sneak in on them. And then later that afternoon, we set up in a spot and had a big 9-pointer that had a doe pushed up against a small pond or a small lake. So it just seems to be there was some commonality in those areas where a buck will try to push a hot doe to get away from all the other bucks. And you know, if you can find that kind of scenario, find that situation, and like Aaron said, a lot of times the buck they have their guard down. They're more focused on the doe, and it's a great time to sneak in and get a shot or call to them, decoy to them. You know, Zach had an incredible series of hunts along a river bottom last year where there was bucks that had does pushed up against the river. So yeah, I guess that's what I would add to it. Look for those kinds of spots.
How do you hold on? Sorry, 1 second. I got dog issue going on in the other room. The joys of recording this at home. Okay. Hopefully that'll get dealt with here in a second. Okay. That's good. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here is, so you mentioned, Aaron, that sometimes you're going to do what we just talked about, where you're going to search out these hot spots, search out this activity, but then there is this other type of rut hunting that you described that a lot of people know, which is find that really good area and hunker down and wait it out. Do you ever still do that now, or is it always now just seek out the hot stuff, move, or is there a time when you know that, hey, you know what, this is such a good funnel, we need to put 2 days here straight and just see what happens? Is that something that it still happens for you guys?
It all depends on the scenario. Say, for example, we only have a weekend to hunt a property and we don't have a lot of sort of backup plans in the area. Maybe it's a fairly small property, public or private, and we only have a weekend to hunt it. And there's one really good spot in the middle of that thing that can cover any crossing action. You might just be best off to sit there. But if the scenario is opposite, where you have lots of other options, and say a big piece, 5,000 acres or something of public land, where you got multiple bedding areas, probably multiple mature bucks living in and around that area, it may serve you best to get out and move and just keep up with the deer. So it all just depends on your situations. I mean, if I was hunting my family farm in Missouri, for example, it's 100 acres, and that's the only place I was hunting for the whole weekend, I would probably be more conservative and try to get in there and sit the best funnels that I knew about all day and expect to see a buck at some point in that time frame, because you just don't have a lot of room to work with. But if it's the opposite of that, then where you can really get out and cover some ground, like Greg said, either from the truck or boots on the ground, then being aggressive and moving around to find them may be a good option. I'm not saying one or the other is necessarily better, but I do think that there's certain situations where one or the other may be more effective.
Yeah.
I guess it is when you're talking about specifics, one or the other could be more effective. When you're talking about general advice, either one can work.
That makes sense. So let's break down some of the general types of places you guys will look at as a potential rut spot, because I know a lot's going to depend on what we just discussed, the sign and, actually seeing deer when you're out there scouting and stuff. But there are some general types of areas that people like to think about during the rut, and maybe those are starting points for you. Of course, people talk about funnels, pinch points all the time. On public land and the kind of stuff you guys are doing, if you are going to go check out one of these spots or set up on one of these spots, what are the types of funnels or pinch points that you've found, are the most effective or worth giving that extra time? Is there anything, Aaron, that you've come to really like? I know you guys have talked about different thermal hubs and things like that where ridges come down. Anything stand out there that's worth covering on?
Regardless of the terrain, I would say any sort of thick transitional area between bedding areas would grab our attention. In the case of the thermal hub, if you're hunting in hill country and a bunch of ridges dump down like spokes on a bicycle wheel into a hub, where that hub is going to connect a bunch of those ridges where does are likely bedding. So therefore, you're going to get a lot of that crossing travel from one bedding ridge to the next bedding ridge in the hub. That's why we like setting up in the hub. But there's lots of other scenarios, terrain types and whatnot. If you're in a swamp or something, for example, and you have two marshes with deer bedding in it, and then maybe a thin strip of timber that's connecting the two of those, that's back there, it's remote, it's away from people, I would concentrate on that. I would say that as general advice would go, we're looking more for either an overlooked funnel between bedding areas or a remote funnel between bedding areas, more so than a funnel between like bedding and feeding.
Yeah. So the remote aspect is pretty easy to figure out. You can find something that's the hardest to get to or the furthest from a parking lot or from a road. But what about the overlooked stuff? How do you pinpoint, or how are you when you're looking at a map or you're scouting out there on the ground and you're trying to figure this stuff out and you're thinking, man, would this spot be worth hitting up even though it seems kind of stupid? How do you think through that? What are some examples of spots like that you would deem overlooked but still worthwhile?
Yeah, it comes down to looking at the whole picture a lot of times, not just the public area that you have to hunt or the particular private area that you have to hunt. Like take OnX or Google Earth or whatever mapping software that you have and just turn off all the layers as far as like the boundaries go, and just look at the overall scope of the area, like where are deer going to bed within that square mile, let's say. Just use that as an example. And then you'll start to be able to connect the dots between these properties. And all of a sudden, you're going to end up with a lot of these overlooked funnels that are right next to the stupid road, where deer crossing, I mean, I'll give you an example. In Michigan, we were there hunting early October last year, but we found a heck of a good crossing between bedding areas. One bedding area was across the road on private land where we could not hunt. One bedding area was a thick, nasty tangle in an old overgrown apple orchard on the public land, but it was right next to the road. I mean, 60 yards from it. And people were literally driving by that apple orchard to park about a half mile in on that public area and then go on back. And nobody was hunting that little apple orchard. Well, you could see rubs coming out of the thing right on the road. And we cut big tracks coming out of it on the gravel that were heading from the private land bedding area to the old overgrown apple orchard bedding area on the public land. So in that situation in the rut, we'd set up right in, real close to the road, as close as legally possible to intercept that line of travel between those two. Obviously, we can't hunt the private land side, but because there's two bedding areas right there, there's some sort of a funnel in between the two, and it's really easy to see if you don't have your blinders on. If you're looking at the whole picture within the area. And that's just one example of overlooked spot right next to the road anyway.
Yeah, I love the idea, though, of zooming out and turning off the layers and just looking at the big picture. I have to remind myself to do that every once in a while, and it does make a huge difference. That is a really, really good idea. Greg, would you add anything on the overlooked aspects of things, how to find those spots?
I was just going to refer to Aaron mentioned the thermal hub, and he'd actually killed a buck just 100 yards off the road a couple years ago, and I think that's another good example of looking at the big picture. Aaron, maybe you can elaborate on that. I mean, it was basically a big woods scenario with that county road running right through the center of it, but you killed that buck literally after he crossed the road.
Yeah, it was in a thermal hub about 100 yards off the road. And there was 4 ridges on the public land side that all dumped into that hub. There was 2 ridges across the road on the private land side that dumped in right there. So that's where the movement was coming from. It could come from any one of those 6 ridges, 2 of them on private, 4 of them on public, but the hub just happened to be on the public side. And it was right there, right on top of the road where you could easily scout it. I mean, we literally just jumped out of the truck, walked like 40 yards, and you can check and see if the scrapes are opened up in that hub to know if bucks are using it or not in late October. And then you know that that's probably going to be a travel corridor in the rut, as it progresses on.
Yeah, I just think that's a good example of how people may, just feel like that's too close to the road. But if you look at the big picture and say eliminate that road, from your mind, and thinking that just deer aren't going to be right there. It's a perfect topographical situation like you described, that hub and all those ridges coming together.
Yeah, and there's some traffic on the road. I mean, there's people driving up and down it occasionally, but we sat in that stand and stared at that road for 3 hours that morning. We had one truck drive in and drive out, and within a minute, we killed a buck. We literally sat there for 3 hours, didn't see anything. And then I looked up, and here comes a buck walking across the road from the private ridges to the hub on the public side and walked right underneath us. And there was another buck right behind him, 30 seconds later, that if we would have been paying attention, Ted could have shot, but we were too stoked after we killed this thing. So, those things are crossing it so quick. Like, we saw that one truck in there in 3 hours time. Those deer are not concerned with that at all. They're not thinking about that. If it was different and there was constant traffic in there, it might It might change it a little bit, but I don't think so. They don't perceive that road as a threat. Unless people were parking right there and going in and hunting them right there actively, then that would be different. But the parking lot is 300 yards on past that, and they avoid that area for sure. But that's because that's where people are parked and where that human sin is concentrated. There's no human sin on that gravel road.
Yeah.
Just where people are driving over it.
So with those thermal hubs, so just to recap for people that aren't familiar, this is a spot where multiple ridges dump down into a little bit of a bottom where they all converge, and then you have all these different trails coming and meeting in this crossing point in the middle. Those are places that notoriously have a lot of sign, a lot of activity, but also notoriously hard to hunt, because when you're at a bottom like that, you can have swirling winds, wonky stuff going on with that. How do you handle the wind in that kind of situation? And how do you handle and choose like a setup in there that minimizes the risk?
Well, once again, it's all situational. And what I found in that particular hub, this would have been the second time I'd ever hunted it. The first time I hunted it with a 10, 12 mile per hour wind, and it was out of the northwest. I mean, it really didn't matter because you're at the bottom of a bowl. But with that wind speed up a little bit, we were getting bad swirling, and deer were picking us off until right at last light on that day that we hunted, when the wind laid down and our scent was just kind of hanging in the air, because you're down low at that point. Once the day winds drop off and you're in a low spot, you're really going to get, extremely low wind speeds down next to no wind. Mm-hmm. And at dusk, we had a buck come by that night that didn't smell us. So the next year going into it, we went in there of a morning with dead calm, high pressure conditions. So, one of those frosty mornings like we're going to have in the Midwest tomorrow morning, where it's going to drop down in the high 20s. There's going to be 2 mile an hour wind, frost for sure. Those types of mornings don't get picked off in almost, the majority of the scenarios until the day winds pick up. Like you can get away with so much because your scent is not traveling very far. It's just hanging right there, either at stand height or it's just dropping to the base of the tree. And that was the case in the thermal hub in this particular instance. Now come 9, 10 o'clock in the morning when the day winds pick up, completely different scenario. It depends on where you're set up in the hub. If you catch some sun on one of those ridges, you could get some thermal pull going up the side, which could help, have a more predicted wind flow. But more often than not, in those low spots like that, when the day winds pick up, it's over with. Because it just starts swirling too much.
Yeah. So all things being equal, I know it's everything situation specific, especially with this kind of thing. But if you had to average it out and you're looking at all the different places like this that you've hunted in the past, would you say more often you would err on hunting right in the bottom where the most activity is all converging, like right in the bottom there, and hoping for a situation like you just described where it's calm and high pressure and you can get away with it? Or do you err on something that's a little bit higher up that maybe is a little bit safer from more wind directions, but you're not able to get as many shots? Is one or the other more common for you?
I would say potentially do both in the same day. Hunt down low early until you're compromised with the wind speed, and then move up to a more conservative location, but you get more predictable wind.
It's an interesting idea. What about you, Greg? Any thoughts on hubs like this?
Not necessarily. I think Aaron hammered it home. Going back to that spot that he'd killed his buck out of is just kind of funny. I'd went back in that spot in 2019 to give it a try. Similar kind of conditions, and apparently some people had caught on to it because there was boot tracks in there and people had been hanging scent wicks in the scrapes right there. So
it's not what you want to see.
Yeah, I mean, that happens sometimes. But, when you see that, it's just time to move on and find somewhere else.
Let's talk about that, which is dealing with hunting pressure during the rut. Because there's obviously an impact from pressure at all times of the year. But how do you guys see it different during the rut? Do you worry about it less, or do you worry about it just the same as if it was October 1st or October 15th? What are your thoughts there, Greg?
Uh, we don't tend to worry about it. In fact, sometimes it works to our advantage. Sometimes it keeps us moving onto other spots and finding new and better locations or areas where there's deer. I'd say that we're pretty fortunate in Iowa. The hunting pressure is very low throughout the majority of the season, other than, about November 1st through the 12th, something like that, first couple of weeks. And then, of course, during the gun seasons. But during the first couple of weeks of November, a lot of times we're going to go hunt a different state. I think like we're going to Tennessee, or most of the guys are going to Tennessee here soon. So, in Iowa, where we spend most of our time hunting, there's just not a ton of hunting pressure. And again, if there is, we're moving on and finding a different spot. In fact, that's how I've found some of the better spots that and had some really good encounters that way. Is the areas that I was going to go hunt, there was people in them, and I just kept on moving and scouted areas where there, look for access points where there just wasn't vehicles. And that happened back in 2018 and ended up having one of the best ruts that I've ever had as far as encountering bucks, just because I was forced to move on and find a new spot because of hunting pressure.
Huh. What about you, Aaron? What do you think about that?
I would say in some instances, hunting pressure in an increased volume of it can actually help you get into more deer. Because it forces deer into pockets at that point. And we noticed this, especially in the rut, because that's when the highest volume of hunters show up. I mean, everybody takes their vacation the first week in November. I shouldn't say everybody. A lot of people do. And if you are dry, if you sacrifice a couple of hunts during that time, say it's a Saturday or a Sunday, and you got 4 or 5 days to hunt, I might just sacrifice a whole day of hunting just to drive around and count the cars at different lots and walk around and look where different guys, where they're hunting at. And just start crossing off these big, vast areas that are getting pressured. And there may be a couple of back corners of thick spots on that area, bedding areas that we're aware of that aren't touched. And usually if you go to those and there's nobody hunting them, they're just a complete circus in there with deer. We've had some just insane rut hunts. I'm talking, seeing 15 to 20 bucks in one day in one bedding area. This is in Iowa, where some of this is happening, but we've seen the exact same scenario play out in other states as well. It gets to be there. You have to spend more time scouting hunting pressure in some of those other states where you have higher volumes of hunting pressure, but by scouting for the pressure and then kind of finding that diamond in the rough out there that's not getting hit, you're really gonna find the deer then. Because you may find yourself in a situation, say it's November 6th or 7th or something, you may find yourself in a situation where there's multiple estrus does that have been pushed into one bedding area. There will be bucks crawling over top of each other in that thing. If you can find it, but you have to be moving around to find it.
Yeah. Talk to me about... Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it seems like they keep coming back to being mobile and being, being flexible. And it seems like just, I don't know how many times, like just moving on and being more mobile, whether it be on foot or be in a vehicle, has paid off for us. So, and that's, again, comes back to, hunting pressure, whether it be hunting pressure or, like Aaron said, it's just a lot of times if, burn a day or two, just scouting hunters essentially, and then eventually finding those pockets of deer.
Can you elaborate on, let's lay out like a hypothetical scenario. Let's say maybe I traveled out of state. I'm going to hunt somewhere. I've got a 7-day rut vacation. Down in southern Ohio or Iowa or somewhere where there's a good amount of public land that I can get after, but there's going to be other guys out there because it is early-ish November. And I've picked out a couple spots on the map ahead of time that look good. These thermal hub spots that you can easily pick out on a map, or some great pinch point or something that looks terrific. But you get in there and there's other tree stands, or you saw boot tracks walking in, and you realize, I have to do this. I have to move on, as you just described, Greg. Can you walk me through in detail what you're doing over the next 4 hours or 8 hours after you've realized, okay, we need to find the stuff because what we thought was the stuff is not, or there's other guys in there. I know you're gonna scout, but what I'm curious is, like, specifically, how are you doing this? Are you walking 10 yards and stopping and glassing, and then walking 10 yards and stopping and glassing, or are you covering ground till the next good looking spot in your map quickly? Which specific things matter more, scrapes versus rubs versus tracks versus tree stands? Like, give me the stupid level of detail on what your November 7th rut scouting would look like after having a pressure impact making you move. And I don't know if either one of you wants to start. Whoever's got a strong idea, I'm curious.
Greg, you want me to go or you want to go?
Go ahead.
All right. I would say it's pretty quick. We're moving fast. If we go into an area and it's just not there, it's not right, too much pressure, we are either looking at plan B and plan B or plan C in the immediate area, or we can walk to and check real quick. And when we're going, we're hauling the mail. Like, we're not jogging through the woods, but we're walking fast and loud and whatever. We're trying to get to the next bedding area to see if there's pressure. But what it comes down to for me is efficiency more than anything. And that's going to come back to the situational deal. If we go into a spot and there's pressure and the next bedding area on that piece is a mile back further in, we might completely abandon that because it's going to take us all day to go back in there and check that thing and then come back out. I'm not saying that we're going to do one or the other. This is just a hypothetical.
Yeah.
If we can get in the truck and we can go and cover 4 or 5 spots in the amount of time that we can cover one on foot, we're going to get in the truck and we're going to drive down the road to the next public area, hop out, run out there and check it as quickly as possible. And what we're doing when we go in there to check is we're looking for everything that you just mentioned, Mark. We're going in there, we're looking for tree stands, looking for fresh limbs being cut, boot tracks, trucks parked on the road, any sort of hunter sign. On top of that, we're also looking for fresh deer sign. We're looking for fresh rubs. We're looking for fresh scrapes, even in the middle of the rut, fresh tracks and any kind of wet soil that we can notice. Even doing some glassing in the early morning or the evening from high points. But I would say through the course of the day, it all comes down to efficiency. It's like, how many of these potential bedding areas where there are deer, especially does living, can we get to in a given day? And there's really no messing around when we're going and scouting those. We're not still hunting really in that scenario. We are just beat feet into those spots. And we might approach those with caution in the last couple 100 yards, but before that we're hauling. And a lot of times along the way we'll run into a mature buck locked down with a doe or something right next to the road, and that may change the plans completely. But efficiency really matters during that time, I feel like.
What would you add, Greg?
I think if you can key in on a spot where there's high visibility, if you're really struggling to find somewhere to get away from hunters, if you can find somewhere that you can just glass into, and you can cover a lot of ground just visually, set up, do an observation sit and move in beyond that, or move on if you don't see anything. I guess going back to 2018, actually would have been about November 5th, November 6th, something like that. I had a situation where, the spot that I wanted to go to, there was vehicles there, and then moved on to another area where there was an access point, where there's a parking lot that, you wouldn't really realize that it was a parking lot. It was kind of, you had to go past somebody's house. It wasn't real obvious. So that was the first thing I was thinking, well, maybe people don't realize you can go park back in here. And there was a bunch of, there was a good mix of cover. It was bottomland, CRP, patches of cottonwood regeneration, and then it rolled up into hardwood timber. So there was a good mix of habitat. So I just started working my way into that. Found rubs and scrapes right by the parking lot. There wasn't any, visible boot tracks. So I didn't have to go very far. I basically went to the first patch of bedding cover and found rubs and scrapes close to that. So I set up there for the evening and saw a bunch of deer coming out of that bedding cover. I think I saw like 15 or 16 deer that night, something like that. It was a really good sit. Didn't see any mature bucks, but from there, I just kept working that area. Basically, just stage hunted my way in and worked in and around that area really throughout the rest of November, throughout the rest of the middle part of November. Never killed a buck. It was like 6 or 7 close calls that I had. It was just kind of crazy. One of those seasons where, it was a great season as far as having encounters, but just didn't arrow a deer. But anyways, I guess that was one of the things I was looking at. It was, an overlooked parking area, and then an area that had fairly high visibility, and just, found the deer sign right away and just kept working through it, and never saw another hunter in there over the course of the rut.
I think that's something we ought to cover real quick, Greg, in detail. Is you didn't go very far in, and that's something that happens to us, I would say, often, not all the time, but we're constantly talking about remote areas, trying to get away from people. But in many situations, it pans out just like what Greg said. You might find a very small area that is overlooked. You pull in there, there's no vehicles. Don't walk by fresh sign on your way in there, especially if there's a really good bedding area like 100 yards from that thing. Because if nobody has been in there within the last day or two, there's a high likelihood, especially if you're in high pressure area, that they've pushed deer into that bedding area. It doesn't matter if it's a mile back or 100 yards. And that's a mistake that we used to make a lot. Was we were always stuck, because it's public land hunting. We were always stuck in that mindset where it's like, we got to go back. We got to get as far as possible. But we've noticed that, just trusting the sign more in the last couple years, like we said, fresh scrapes. And when we're talking about fresh sign, I mean, it's sign that was laid down in the last day and a half. And we are looking for that stuff every single day of the season, including in the rut. It's rained here in Missouri this week, for example. But Ted and I have been scouting throughout the week, not just for random scrapes, but for scrapes that have been worked in the rain or since the latest rain. And we haven't found very many of them, but it's like, if you wake up in the morning and it's been a downpour all night, you go out there and you start checking scrapes and you find one that was worked, and you can visibly see like dry dirt that was turned up in the scrape. It was worked since that rain. So you're right on top of them at that point. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're just right on them. And that's another thing with tracks too, is it's like the sharper the track is, when you find it, kind of depends on the soil that you're finding in, the grass or whatever. But if you really look in detail at the track itself, you can figure out if it was really fresh or if it's old. Same thing with like deer poop a lot of times. And like Greg was mentioning with the rubs earlier, with the bark laying on top of freshly fallen leaves. I don't really care during the rut if there's a rub there that was made in late September or early October. But if there's a rub there that's shining, bleeding, like Greg said, like what Dan Infalt refers to, that's something you got to pay really close attention to. I mean, literally, we've taken 3 steps a lot of times past that type of sign and bumped a giant buck, because they're right on top of that fresh sign. And that's not always the case, but fresh sign doesn't lie like that. I mean, we've got into big bucks in areas where there's very, very little fresh sign, or it was extremely difficult to see. But when you do find it, it doesn't lie. They're right there, and they are usually not too far.
Now, what about a situation where, like you guys are in most situations, at least in Iowa, is that you're looking for a mature buck, not just any buck. So when you're hitting this first hot sign and it's fresh, but it's not obvious big bucks on it. You're not seeing an obvious big buck track. You're not seeing a thigh size rub, but there's a bunch of fresh scrapes, fresh rubs, but you don't know what it is. Is that still going to stop you, or do you need some kind of confirmation that a big buck's been here? Because there's a difference between where a young buck is going to cruise versus a big one.
Yeah, and that's a great point. The other day, for example, we were scouting. We found a fresh scrape amongst a pile of fresh rubs, but they were little bitty, spindly rubs. They weren't worked real aggressively, and the fresh scrape was just pawed like one time. and you could tell it hadn't been worked aggressively. And this, I would say this is just general advice. I don't know that this is the case in every situation, so bear with me on it here. But for the most part, when a mature buck goes in there and works a scrape, especially this time of year, they are going to work it pretty aggressively. But with that said, I've seen a lot of them walk up to just the branch and work the licking branch and move on. However, aggressive rubbing, aggressive scraping, big tracks, that tends to lend itself to a bigger animal of some kind. It depends on the area that you're hunting too. It could be a 3-year-old buck in Missouri or in Michigan or something like that, where that's, one of the older bucks in the area that's leaving that sign. But we've certainly seen that in Missouri this week. We're hunting a low density area, all timber, basically just acorn fat deer. And we ran into that the other day where there were several scrapes, but they were not aggressive. It was the same spot you and Ted hunted in September, Greg, where there's like 6-7 scrapes. There's lots of rubs, but there was very little aggressive fresh sign within that area. And all we saw was little 1.5 year old bucks and no does. So the type of sign, like you mentioned, Mark, does matter. If that's what you're after, is a mature buck.
Yeah.
I would.
Go ahead, Greg.
Sorry. I was just going to say, going back to that sign I found yesterday morning going in, it was like pretty aggressive rubbing. There were saplings that were broken over. Just the bark was shredded. There was 5 or 6 fresh scrapes, well-worked scrapes there. And then, then we called that buck up out of that draw, basically where all that sign was laid down. So that to me was a good indication that there was some kind of older age class buck in that area with an aggressive, seemingly aggressive demeanor. And, sure enough, that rattling sequence brought him up out of the draw and he came right to the decoy. So that was one of those situations where, it all came together nicely, and we assumed there was a good one in that area. But, I guess for us, we're not really worried about shooting a 5-year-old buck in Iowa, a nice 3 or 4-year-old buck. Good for us. We're just not super picky, but it's nice when you get those older bucks, especially that, like the one that Aaron got.
Once you start talking about getting up in 5-year-old and older bucks, those are anomalies in whatever environment you hunt in, including Iowa, unless you're on some big private managed tract.
Yeah.
You almost have to hunt those deer specifically, where I shouldn't say that you have to, but a 5-year-old buck is going to leave similar sign to a charged up 3-year-old buck.
Yeah.
A lot of times you might have a 150-inch wide 3-year-old buck that's just tearing up the woods, but in a lot of areas that's going to get people pretty fired up, including me, regardless of where it is. So, I think what you just said there makes a lot of sense, Greg, because that buck that we killed a couple weeks ago, that was in a similar scenario, even though it was in mid-October. And this was an area that had very little deer sign in it, but the little bit of deer sign that was there was big sign. Like we found just 2 rubs and no scrapes leading into this bedding area, but both the rubs were super fresh and they were huge and aggressive rubs. And then we went in there the next day and killed a mature buck. And that was the only deer that we saw in there. So, if that's what you're after is a mature buck for your area, you might not run into a lot of that type of sign. But, several times where we're hunting low density areas, we might just find 1 or 2 sets of big fresh tracks coming in and out of a bedding area, especially if you find them going in and coming out and got on a mature buck in that same area.
Yeah. You talked about bedding areas a handful of times here. When you're talking about the specific kind of scouting you would do, you mentioned you're going to carry the male until you get to that next bedding area, and then you'll slow down and focus on that, and then you want to hit the next bedding area. And I know that focusing on bedding is something you guys do religiously in a lot of cases, and you've talked in the past a lot about buck bedding areas and zeroing in on those during certain parts of the year. Do you care about quote-unquote buck bedding at all during the rut, or is it 100% shifted to doe bedding areas at this point? Or if not, what's the mix?
I would say any sort of bedding area is important during the rut, because even the spots with just does and little bucks in it all of October, all that could change in the matter of a few hours in the rut. I mean, a hot doe gets in there, mature buck is going to be in there and honor in, fairly quickly. And if you can somehow manage to stay with that hot doe through her breeding cycle, you're going to see the whole gamut, as far as the hierarchy of bucks in that area. We've seen that over and over again. It's like, man, when you found her, doesn't matter if it's 40 yards from the car, they're all going to be there sooner or later, or they're going to push her out of there into the next spot, and they're all going to be there in that spot until they drop her, and then they're going to go to cruising. But that's one thing I'll say about, big mature bucks, especially dominant bucks in an area. They just, in a higher deer density area, they don't seem to cruise as much. Like the younger bucks will, because they can't go in there and push the big guy off the doe. But those big mature bucks, there's so many deer in some of those areas. If you think about Michigan or Pennsylvania, where we just came from, there's so many does in those areas. A mature buck doesn't need to cruise until the end of the rut. I mean, for the most part, they're going to bounce from, the first doe that's in heat to the next doe that's in heat. And they're going to kick whatever small buck off of her that they have to when she comes in. And if she's not quite in yet, they're going to hang back and stay with her in that general area. I mean, they might not be right on top of her, but they're going to be in that general area until she does come in. And then they'll come in there and kick those little bucks off.
So let's paint a hypothetical scenario like that. Let's say you can see into a bedding area. Maybe it's like just tall, thick, brushy grass and bushes and stuff like that. And for whatever reason, you were hunting kind of outside of it, and you could see into it, and you see a mature buck bumping a doe around. But it's not just one, but he's checking does, checking a family group, and it's getting there, but maybe it's not quite to the stage where he's locked on dogging her for 500 yards. But to your point, it's getting close. You're in that situation. Do you move in as tight as you can on a downwind edge where you can safely, sit and wait around for a while and just say, okay, over the next day or two, one of these does has got to pop. He's in here. This is a spot of interest. He's going to pass through here eventually. Or are you going to zero in on exactly the tree you saw him go running by that's right in the middle and try to dive in there to kill him the next morning? Exactly, what you saw. I mean, how much do you chase specific observations versus zones?
That probably depends on the situation, but I would err more on the side of what Greg was talking about a while ago when it comes to stage hunting. If I was in an area, and that kind of goes back, that's kind of like how that hunt played out last year, Greg, with that decoy buck on that little piece of walk-in.
Yep, exactly.
We observed a bunch of does in there and a mature buck in that scenario, and we basically just chipped away at that area for about 3 days until we got a shot. If you're bow hunting, there's a lot of luck involved. I mean, especially in the rut, like you got to get those suckers within 25 yards somehow or another, and their movements can be somewhat unpredictable. But if you do see that scenario that you're talking about, Mark, I would say move in tighter on the next sit when permitting. Maybe not on the exact spot, but somewhere in and around that thing. Because that buck isn't going to move off very far, especially if there's a doe that you think is getting ready to come in. Or there's a big group of does in there in general. Like just hanging with those does and being in that area is going to put you in the game. So I would say stay right in there with them. I mean, I'd be aggressive enough to getting tight enough to that bedding area to shoot into the edge of it to where you could kill a buck if he was cruising down on the downwind side or whatever. I wouldn't sit back and just continue continuously observe that. Once I saw that movement, I would dive in there, but then I would stage hunt around it, in different spots until, eventually they moved out of there or shot a buck.
What would you say, Greg?
Yeah, I totally agree. And then also, with that picture that you just painted, kind of going back to the decoys, if possible, just using a decoy in that kind of scenario, if it makes sense. And Aaron's example of the decoy buck he killed last year, he was basically stage hunting that property in, but was using a decoy the entire time. And that eventually, was how he killed the buck. Rattled, he saw the buck, rattled, and then several minutes later, the buck comes up over the rise and is right in your face.
Yeah, and that morning we saw like how many different bucks in there on those does. I don't even know. There was a pile of them. I mean, there was a big group, a family group of does that was living in this tiny, tiny bedding area in this very, very small overlooked piece of walk-in hunting land. And for whatever reason, it was just off to the side. I mean, there's several larger pieces of public ground that are nearby that are several thousand acres in size. And this one piece is like a couple hundred acres, and it's mostly just grass with a few little draws in there. But there's a couple family groups of does living in those draws. And when one or more of those does is in heat or close to going in heat, that's when all the bucks in the area show up right there. And that's what we had in that scenario. We got to that point by hunting the bigger public pieces and then running into hunting pressure, as we were talking about earlier, and eventually got sick of running into hunters. So we bounced around until we found that. But yeah, once we found it, it was just a stage deal. It took 3 days before we got our shot. But it was just bouncing in there, moving in a little bit at a time. I mean, I'm going to say on that 300 acres, there was 3 general bedding draws in it where deer were spending their time during the day. So we hunted observation the first night, gathered data on all those draws from watching does and bucks coming out of them. Second day, we hunted draw number 1. Second evening, we hunted draw number 2. Third morning, we hunted draw number 3, killed a buck.
Can you illustrate what you were thinking about and looking at when you chose the specific tree on, let's say, your day 2 or day 3 hunt? As you hung out on the edge and observed, but then in day 2 or 3, you're making a specific move to hit one of these draws. And I think something that a lot of people struggle with is they know the general kind of spot they should be looking for, but it's kind of next level to be able to get to the point where you know how to pick the spot within the spot. Can you describe, if you recall, or make it up, hypothetical, whatever, but the kinds of stuff that you would be specifically looking at, thinking about as you're picking the exact spot to hunt the tree, the location that's going to make this work? I think that kind of illustration would help it kind of sink home for people.
Well, when scouting or observing, you're watching these deer come out of these things. Like that first evening when we observed deer coming out of those draws and sort of moving across that area, we're watching where those trails are, which side of the draw they're coming out of, and or crossing into, and then making a game plan to set up on that trail the next morning. But in the dark, when we crept in there that morning, we found a fresh scrape on the tip of the draw as we were moving up there. So we didn't even get to the trail where we saw the deer come out the evening before. We just set up over top of that scrape at the first available tree. In fact, there was actually an old tree stand in the tree where somebody had hunted in the past, but they hadn't hunted it recently. So in this particular instance, it was just observing movement and then going in and sitting on that, depending on the wind. I obviously don't want to set up on that trail with my wind blowing straight into it. I want to set up somewhere across from it where wind is blowing away from that predicted movement that we had saw the night before. And there's probably no real, there was just a few available trees in that draw to get into. And since that was only our second hunt into the area, I still wanted to be in a tree if I could, so that I could observe while I was hunting that specific movement. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like I'm hunting I'm hunting that 20-yard trail coming out of that draw that we watched deer come out of the evening before. But I'm also getting in one of the few trees in there where I can observe across that most of that property. So you're in position to kill, but you're also gathering data from observing at that time too.
Yep. At this time of year, sorry to cut you off, Aaron, but at this time of year, when you're in the rut and you're doing something like what you just described, and you're trying to pick the tree, and you've got a tree that's in the perfect spot for the things you just described, you can observe, but you're also within range of the trail you want to be hunting, and the wind's really good there. You've got that tree, but it's lousy for cover. It's a bean pole. Would you pick that one, or would you pick the tree that's subpar location? Maybe you have to sacrifice on one of those three factors I just described, sight or shooting range or wind, but it's a big old gnarly multi-branched oak that you would be invisible in and you can get away with murder. Which would you choose, or what would you be thinking about when trying to make that decision?
It kind of depends on the specific conditions that day, but for the most part, we want to be able to shoot that trail. Because if you're 60 yards away in the perfect tree and a buck walks down that trail, you're SOL, unless you have a decoy or something like what Greg's talking about, which is what we did bring into play on this particular hunt. As I said, and as you're alluding to, there wasn't a lot of good trees in there. So in order for us to place the deer in front of our stand, we had to use calling and a decoy. But in other types of scenarios, maybe you're not hunting an open scenario and it's thicker, or you're in big woods or something like that where deer can't see a decoy from a distance. I would err on the side of hunting right over the trail, even if the tree's a beanpole. I mean, maybe a ground setup is better there where you can get more cover. The main thing is you either want to be able to place that deer in front of you with the use of a decoy or calling or whatever, or you got to set up where the deer is crossing through within bow range. Because if you don't do either one of those things and a deer walks down that trail, you're not going to be able to get a shot at him. And I feel like your first time in that spot is going to be the time when you get your chance.
Yeah. And would you agree that you probably can get away with a little bit more during the rut too, as far as it's, that buck hopefully has other things on his mind other than picking you out of a tree. He might be cruising through fast or nose to the ground, that kind of thing too.
I would say it depends on the scenario though. If you're hunting the edge of a bedding area with a lot of deer in it, and a lot of does specifically, like say you're hunting Michigan or PA where you got lots of does and they are used to looking up in trees at hunters, you're going to have to be real careful with that. Yeah. But if you're in a scenario like where I'm talking about, in this particular example, there's not high deer density overall. And in that scenario, you're likely going to see, a couple of deer on your set, and one of them might be a buck that you want to shoot. So I'm willing to sacrifice that cover in order to get the shot. But if I'm in a scenario, say it's an evening hunt, and a bunch of deer are leaving a bedding area and they're heading to a food source, a bunch of does specifically, maybe it's at the beginning or the end of the rut, and it's like that scenario you were talking about earlier where they haven't popped yet. They're close, but they're not quite in heat yet. Well, big boy is going to lay back behind them and come out after they've all went through the danger zone outside the bedding area. You know how they do.
Uh-huh.
So in that situation, you've got to prioritize cover. Otherwise, a mature doe is going to walk through there and bust you, and that's going to be the end of your night. So yeah, it all goes back to the situation. But if possible, I'm trying to get hidden where I can shoot that trail.
Yeah, I'm living the second scenario you described right now, in that I'm chasing a buck and there's 10 million does around here, and anytime you want to get into the good stuff where I know this buck is spending time, where I've had a couple observations, it's just nearly impossible to get away with not having a doe go downwind to you eventually, because they're just crisscrossing. So it's this constant battle between wanting to get to where you need to be to shoot the buck while also figuring out how to do that without other deer figuring you out. And that's a tightrope act That's a pain in the butt, not easy.
It's very tough. And honestly, like, I'm not in your situation, so I couldn't even begin to tell you what to do. But, I mean, a wet, windy day of any kind where you can slide in the back door there is your friend in those types of scenarios, what we've found anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, man, when it's wet and windy, those deer, you can just get away with murder. I mean, you can walk right by them in the dark.
Yeah.
As long as the wind is in your favor, you can walk by a lot of deer without spooking them. But I mean, if it's going to be like it is tomorrow morning, where it's frosty and crunchy and dead calm, extremely difficult to get
that's not the day.
Yeah, extremely difficult.
Yeah, I've been dying for a nice, crisp, consistent wind. The last couple days, I've been hunting a spot where that description I just gave you, where there's all these does and this buck I'm after, I'm having these nights where, as it often does, where the winds will die down towards the end of evening, but it's been extreme. It's gone from a nice, good wind to 0 at the end. And then I've been in a situation where I'm not getting the high pressure thermals lifting up or anything. It's just pooling around the bottom and little swirls and stuff. And, you know, even when I went in thinking that wind was going to be great, when you've got 10, 15 does coming from different directions, and if one gets squirrely and every single damn one of these deer looks in every tree they walk past, and then you just know, the jig is up again. It's interesting, that's for sure. But Greg, before we move on, I want to make sure to get your thoughts on what we were just talking about there with Aaron, as far as some of the detail stuff you would look at when trying to pick the spot within the spot, or picking the right tree. Anything else that you do or think about that we didn't cover there yet?
Not really. I guess I would mention that I think you can get away with more, especially like in small trees. If you're hunting out of a tree saddle, or even hunting off the ground, like we've just gotten away with setups that I think a lot of people just, wouldn't think it's possible. Just wouldn't think to do it. And tree saddles are amazing, especially with one person. With two people, it gets a little bit tough.
Mm-hmm.
But man, if you got a trunk that's just barely big enough to hide behind, or even if you can, if you can rotate your way around the tree, as if deer are coming in, to hide your profile. I think that's a great way to get in close in those situations, or just hunting off the ground. If it's legal where you're at, to build up a little bit of a ground blind, get some front cover, get some back cover. I don't know how many times we've been in situations where, we've ended up shooting a deer because we had to get to a certain spot and we just had to make it work. And a lot of times it's resorted to hunting off the ground or just making do with what you have. And especially with, like I said, with the saddles are an advantage if you can hide behind the trunk of a small tree.
Yeah. All right. What about this scenario? Because I hunt out of a saddle too. Love them, as you guys described. It gives you a lot of benefits. But one of the things I've wondered, so imagine you're in a situation where you can't use the trunk to hide you. So the deer are going to be exposed to you to some degree. And I know this can depend on how many branches and everything and the cover in the tree. But something I've wondered is when you've got that big old mature doe that's going to walk by you and all right, this is the moment of truth. It's coming up. She's going to come by close and you need to do, where you're trying to become invisible. Do you try to stand as tight to the tree trunk as possible and try to blend in with the trunk, or do you lean back and try to have that kind of angled position like a tree branch coming up? Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, exactly what you mean. That's a good question. I guess I find myself just trying to hide tight to the trunk of the tree.
That's usually what I do, but I wonder if maybe
you're on something. Yeah, just be the branch.
What do you think, Aaron?
Yeah, another thing that the ground helps with, the ground setup in that scenario, is you can move a lot quicker and easier. So say you're not hunting over a food plot or directly over a food source, but you're hunting that transition coming out of bedding, from bedding to food, and you have mature does come by an hour and a half before dark. If you can lay back 60, 70 yards away from that trail, while those does are coming by, wait for the does to move by, and then make, a quiet but quick effort to get up there within 20 yards of that trail to shoot the deer that's going to come after that. Sometimes you can have luck doing that as well. And that's where the ground will give you the advantage over being in a tree. because once you're up there, that is one good thing I will say about the saddles is, I mean, we just did that a couple, last week or whatever. We observed from the tree, saw the buck moving 50 yards away, and then got down out of the tree and then moved to get in position to kill him within 10 minutes or whatever. So it's definitely doable. And it just depends on the situation that you're in. If you're hunting a food plot or something like that, though, I mean, or an area where deer are congregating at last light, then you obviously can't get away with that. Yeah. But just thought, I guess.
Yeah, I think overcoming those mental blocks that you can't get down and go after a deer. I mean, you go back to 2018, and that's what Jake and Ted did. Ted shot the buck of a lifetime by seeing bucks cruising on a trail. They were 60, 70 yards away, however far, got down in the last half hour of the hunt, made a quick ground blind, and this buck comes by on the same trail, and he shoots him at 20 yards. Same thing that Aaron did the other day. A lot of people would think, oh, I can't get down. The buck is 50 yards just over the ridge. I can't get down. But, he ends up killing a great buck by being smart and aggressive at the same time.
Yeah, man, that was a great buck, Aaron. I got to ask, though, did you check his ears and eyes? Are you sure you didn't have, some serious damage to some of those senses? I couldn't believe
I could not believe that thing could not hear me grunting up there. I was grunting as loud as I could. And, I mean, some people were saying that they thought that he heard it and picked up his head a few times, and he just didn't care, which might have been the case. I don't know. I mean, his senses were working fairly well because we spooked the crap out of him the day before that.
True.
But he did have a cataract or something in his right eye. His right eye looked funky. His left eye looked fine. But his right eye did look funky. And in the footage, it looks like I'm just in the wide open woods where I shoot him. But we were actually up in this big deadfall with a bunch of back cover.
Gotcha.
In shadows and stuff. So I think that is another reason why he couldn't see us. And just standing there, obviously we're sitting in that big deadfall pointing out towards the deer, but we probably should have filmed back to the deadfall where you could see where we were actually hid. It was just a huge, horizontal trunk that was coming over there. It was perfect little setup for on the ground.
Yeah, that worked out perfect. That's for sure.
That's what I like about hunting out of the tree and the ground. I mean, it's just hunting. But regardless of how you do it, whether you dig a freaking hole in the ground or you're hunting out of an elevated box blind or whatever, I mean, it doesn't matter. The main thing though is being able to get close enough to deer to shoot them with a bow. Yeah. If you're not close enough, then you're not going to get a chance. And the tree helps tremendously in that hunt, particularly because once we got to the ground, we couldn't even see in the bedding area where he was at. So, we were able to observe in there, like we've been talking about throughout this podcast, is like when you can get up high and you can observe a great distance and observe movement of what the deer are doing right now, you can gain a ton of information and then get down and go get them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So here's another scenario, and it's probably going to be pretty similar to some of the things you guys described, but I just want to see if this unique situation cues any other ideas. We talked a little bit about if we saw a buck that was kind of bumping some does around, but they weren't quite ready yet, and what you guys would do. What about the situation that a lot of guys might see on the 7th of November or the 15th of November, which is they see a buck locked on a doe, and he sees, push that doe into a little pocket of cover, and they're in there, and it's 10 o'clock in the morning. Can you walk me through what you're thinking about in that situation? I know is it windy? Is it rainy? Could you make a move, or do you sneak in later? I mean, I know there's a lot of situation-specific stuff, but Aaron, maybe walk me through a few of your thoughts when you see that, and what options might you consider on the table for what to do next.
We've been in that scenario before, haven't we, Greg? For about 4.5 hours straight one day.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I would say as long as you don't spook the doe, you can get away with just about anything. That mature buck, when she's in heat, he is not going to leave her. I mean, you can, like I said, Zach practically walked up to one and shot it in New York. I mean, literally just on a walking path. And the thing was just half dumb. That's just the way they act when they're with the doe.
Mm-hmm.
But like Greg alluded to earlier, they'll push them up in those spots that are just funky and weird. And that's why people struggle, I think, with the lockdown. And I've struggled with it for many, many years, is because we're hunting the same old spots, a funnel or whatever, back where we've seen deer through October and early November, expecting to see the big guy, when he's got that doe sequestered off somewhere in a tiny little thick pocket of brush or a fence row or a waterway or like up against a river or a railroad tracks, whatever. He's got her pushed out there away from the other deer because they're trying to breed and he's trying to fend off those other bucks. So in that scenario, I think it's best to just inch in there and get the wind right and get right in there as close as you possibly can without spooking the doe. And if you can use decoys and calling, that can work extremely well too. But you've got to get within their bubble. It's like you've got to get within, 100 yards of that thing to challenge him enough to come over there and run you off. Unless he loses track of the doe, which has happened to us in the past before, and they've come, stiff-legged walking all the way across the field to you. So it kind of depends on the scenario, but the main thing is just to stay with them as long as you can and look for your opportunity to get in there. Say, for instance, you're watching them for 200 yards and they both lay down and the day winds pick up. Well, there's your chance. Now maybe you can start to crawl in there and get tighter. Main thing is, though, don't spook the doe. You spook her, then you're going to start all over again. I mean, they may only run 300 yards and then go right back to what they were doing. But you can get away with him staring a hole right through you. But once she figures you out, he's going to go with her.
Now, a lot of times these bucks will hook up with a doe and, spend a couple days with her and be on her side at all times. How long will you sit on a spot like that? So let's say you see this, you made your move, but it didn't pan out, and the doe led the buck a different direction and you weren't able to get on him. Would you be set up right in there the same thing next morning, or set up on the movement you saw them take out of there? How would you think about the next 24 to 36 hours?
I think Jake and Ted had a good example of that last year. They spooked a buck and a doe a buck had a doe pinned up against the lake, and they were going in they spooked the deer, and, they lost sight of the deer, but Jake and Ted got to the point where they'd spooked them and basically came up with a plan. They figured, what's the next, best block of cover where these deer are going to be. And they looped around. They may have made a couple different setups, but they worked their way in towards where they figured the deer would be, and just were doing calling sequences and kept, getting closer and closer. And like Aaron referred to, getting into that bubble. Now, they couldn't see the deer, but they were calling into these pockets where they assumed the deer were. And eventually the buck left the doe and came up out of there after they had done a calling sequence and came into 10 yards. And Ted, unfortunately, got a little buck fever or target panic or whatever it was. He shot in front of the deer. But I mean, it was just an awesome hunt where, maybe a lot of people think, I spooked the deer, it's over. Maybe I can just come back in here and sit in here tomorrow. But those guys just went in the direction of those deer, kept after them, kept calling and just working their way in. And eventually Ted was, had a hunt of a lifetime with this giant 8-pointer at 10 yards. It's just.
Well, that's what you and I did a couple years ago too, Greg, in that cedar thicket. I mean, we saw that buck. He saw us, the buck did, from 40 yards away. But we crouched down immediately, and we're like, the only reason why he could be standing there and not spooked is he's got to have a doe. Because why else would a mature buck be standing there dumb looking at you in what's almost the wide open? It's chest high grass, but we were just walking up the access path, a couple hundred yards from the car, and just look up and this thing is just staring right at us. So we looped around, got the wind in our favor, and then crept into that little cedar thicket that he was in. And that's exactly what we did, Greg. We crept in there, called, snort wheeze, raking branches, everything. And then we moved up 100 yards, did it again. I think like the third time we did it, we heard that buck snort wheeze back at us. And then what commenced was a 4.5 hour just game of cat and mouse in there with him as he's pushing this doe around. Greg was at full draw on the thing like 4 different times and just couldn't get a shot through that thick brush.
Decoy would have been game changer, even just like a
game changer. Yeah,
heads up decoy, just something visual.
Absolutely.
So all this,
man. I mean, those are.
Go ahead, Greg.
Go ahead. Well, I was just gonna say those hunts are so fun. Like, like Aaron referred to, a lot of people struggle with the lockdown, and we did for a long time too. But it just seems like the past few years, as we've adopted a little bit more aggressive hunting strategy, that all of a sudden we're having a lot of fun with these kinds of scenarios where you're working in on a buck and trying to decoy him in, call him in, and get in his bubble and get him mad enough to come out and come to you. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But back to what you kind of initially were talking about there, Mark. Like if you were to leave from an evening hunt where you saw a mature buck with a doe, I would say, depending on the scenario, the next morning I tried to get it in there where you could observe at first light, somewhere where you could see down in there to where they were at. And if you can't do that, then I'd probably go about it just like the way that we're talking right now. Just creep in there, maybe sit for 15, 20 minutes, watch, what you can see, call a little bit, keep the wind in your favor until you find them. And just continually move with them until you're in there, right there in their kitchen with them.
But your assumption would be that they'd be back in there the next day, right? You're assuming that doe lives somewhere around there and she's coming back, and that buck's going to be there too, and that's what you're starting with.
I would assume they're going to be that. That would be my first guess until proven wrong. Anyway, like in which case sometimes you do go in after that set or after that scenario and you move around and you don't find him, and she's literally taking him, a half mile or a mile away somewhere that you don't know about, because a lot of things can happen at night, after you leave the woods. But going with, your latest intel is usually your best idea at that point.
Yeah. Now, all this stuff that you've been talking about, the aggressive, making a move on the ground, pushing in tight, sneaking in, calling in, all that kind of stuff. You're talking about doing this on big chunks of public land where you've got options and you can move around, and if it doesn't work out in spot A, you could always go to spot B and whatever. Would you, and you sort of caveated this earlier, Aaron, when we were talking about something along these lines, but at a more general level, for someone listening to this and they don't hunt a bunch of public land, but they hunt like heavily pressured small property kind of stuff, like your 100-acre family farm in Missouri, something like that. Would you cross all this stuff off the list if you only have that 100 acres of private and there's a bunch of other hunters around you? Or is there a time to still get aggressive like this, even though you just have your 80 or your 100 to work with? How do you balance that?
I would say some sort of a hybrid of both. If you can go in there, and this all really comes down to time. It depends on how much time you have to hunt the area that you're in and to fulfill the goals that you have for your tag. Like if you go into a small property and you've got a hell of a funnel area in the middle of that thing that, you can sit and wait a buck out and eventually get a shot at one moving from bedding area to bedding area, then as we said in the beginning, that's a tried and true proven strategy that works. And we're not discounting that by any means. But if you try that and it's not working, then you can flip a switch and start moving around and looking, even if it's on a small property. I mean, I think back to my hunts on that small farm when I was a kid, and we killed a lot of bucks doing that in the rut, just sitting and just eating lunch in the stand, waiting there all day for days and days and days on end, not even seeing a deer. And then all of a sudden here comes a mature buck and you shoot him. But at the same time, I can also remember a hunt. I think it's the last deer I killed with a rifle down there during Missouri's rifle season. I had sat 2 days in a row all day, and then I watched a buck cruise by out of range for my old 30-30. And I had to get down, move around. Even though I didn't have much room to work with on our property, I went clear to our northeast fence line and was at the very corner of our property in the direction that buck went. And I actually heard him fighting with another buck right over the ridge. And I crept over the ridge and shot him while he was fighting with that buck. In which case, if I would have just sat there in my stand after he moved off I don't know if I would have got another chance at him. So it kind of just depends on the specific scenario, even down to the day that you're hunting. But I think the main thing is that you're going to hear us harp on constantly, just kind of as a group, is the ability to adapt to those and to not be afraid to try something different should something not be working. If you have a lot of time to hunt and you trust that funnel, though, that can be extremely deadly. If you can just sit there, if you have the patience to do that, you can certainly kill them doing that as well. You know, maybe in that scenario, you don't get down and go after the buck that I killed and you just sit there, but maybe you kill him 3 days later, coming right back through the same funnel. It's hard to say. But like I said in the beginning of this particular thought, it all comes down to time. If you don't have the time to really put into sitting those funnels, then you got to adapt and change something, you know, if it's not been effective for you.
Yeah. What do you think, Greg?
You know, one thought I had is again, kind of going back to mental hurdles and really conservative hunting is this fear of spooking deer.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many times that, you know, in situations where we did spook deer and we're able to get back on them. Like just because you bump a deer doesn't mean it's all over.
I think I've actually spooked deer worse that came by me and I like blind called to out of a tried true stand location. And then a mature buck circled downwind, caught my wind, and then knew I was there in the area and left. Like I feel like I've done more damage to that deer right then than walking up on him in the woods most of the time.
Yep.
Because you're catching him by surprise, you know, and even if he does figure out what the heck you are, it's like, what the heck? There's a human walking through my woods. I'm not used to seeing that, you know, but if they smell you and they get a good whiff of you, especially a mature buck, that's when you're in trouble. Otherwise, all bets are off. I mean, they may come right back to the same exact spot where they were at if you don't spook them real hard.
Yeah, it's been fun to see how many times over these past few years that aggressiveness has paid off. I kind of come from the, you know, hunting the small farm growing up, heavily pressured and public land as well. And have always been a pretty conservative hunter. And part of that is just personality driven as well. You know, I feel like I can sit in a stand for a long time and just wait it out. But, you know, now we got all these guys, different personalities and hunting styles. It's interesting to see how, you know, it can pay to be aggressive and overcoming some of those mental hurdles of just being so afraid to spook a deer or just to get out of your comfort zone. I think when you start to do some of these things that we've talked about in this podcast, you can first have a lot of fun doing it, learn a lot, and also, a lot of times it pays off in field tags or at least close encounters.
Yeah. So let's wrap it up because there's a lot more we could talk about, but I know you guys have got to edit. You guys have got to get going, got to leave Walmart parking lots and head back to the old hunting grounds. So I don't want to keep it too much longer, but I want to ask one final question because you kind of alluded to mental hurdles, Greg. And in this case, you were talking about, you know, just getting over these things we assume you shouldn't do, but actually you guys are doing it. I feel like in addition to that, there's a lot of other mental stuff going on during the rut. Like for a lot of people, this is when we put the most expectations on ourselves. We've put our vacation time towards this. All of our hopes and dreams are here. For a lot of people, it means you're spending day after day grinding it out. There's a lot of things that can be tough in certain ways, even though it's that time of year we enjoy and look forward to the most. What would be for each of you one thing that you think matters the most to having success at this time of year when it comes to the mental side of it, the mental toughness or stamina or something that you need during the rut? Greg, is there anything that comes to mind that we can leave folks with as far as that?
I think mental preparedness, like you say, you get tired as you grind it out during the rut. I mean, it's just inevitable. You know, day after day, you're going to be tired, but I try to, every time I get into a setup, try to play out the scenario that I may happen. Can I shoot behind me? Can I shoot to my left? Can I shoot to my right? What are my shooting lanes? What's the distance? And, I'm thinking back to last year, a buck I shot. I was self-filming at the time, so I was having to make sure, where can I film? Can I film kind of behind me if a deer comes behind to the left? And that's what ended up happening. And I had practiced that with the camera, with drawing back. And that's exactly what the buck did. And I was able to pull off that shot with confidence because I had thought about it ahead of time. So, just trying to keep, mentally prepared. And, even though you may be tired and just want to sit back and relax, just trying to think through all the scenarios, because during the rut, as we all know, it can happen in a flash. And if you're not ready, if you haven't, maybe you don't have the range, or maybe you're just unsure of if you can shoot in a certain direction. It's just, I found so many times that it helps to be mentally prepared and think about all these scenarios, or at least as much as possible.
Yeah. What do you think, Aaron?
I would just piggyback on what he just said. And I really want to hammer home rest, because that's a huge thing, especially when it comes to being mentally sharp. If you're on a week's vacation, rut hunting all day long, and you're on public ground and you're grinding, like you're burning a lot of calories throughout the day out there, freezing your butt off and trying to get on these things. And what typically happens is towards the end of your week is your best hunting, because that's when you have had time to figure out what the heck is even going on. And that's when you need to be the most sharp mentally. And consequently, the opposite happens, because you've been pushing so hard all week that you're mentally drained, you're physically drained, you haven't had good sleep, you're eating freaking your 10th meal at the Casey's gas station.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is you do get your opportunity later in that week and you screw it up because you're not thinking through all those fine details that Greg just mentioned. So I would look at it more so as like, try to go into it with some sort of an efficient plan to scout, find the deer, and prioritize your rest. Figure out where the heck you're camping at ahead of time so that you can camp as close as possible to your hunting locations. Set up camp in your truck if you need to. Make sure that you have comfortable gear to camp in if that's the case. Make sure that you have food prepared that, is legit, not eating this garbage. I mean, I've done it. I've ate so many pieces of Casey's pizza, it's not even funny. But, I mean, you got to think, if you think all that stuff through ahead of time, you're going to have way more energy going into it. Because the smallest little mistake, like if you set up on the ground and you don't plan for that shooting lane at 20 yards and there's grass or a twig or something in the way, you're talking about, the difference between success and failure and one small little detail that was overlooked. Now, and I'm not trying to put pressure on any of your listeners to do these things. Just think of it the opposite way. Think of it like, okay, I'm here for a week. We got to prioritize rest and efficiency. And then when we get in kill mode in those situations, we got to go through the checklist like what Greg just mentioned. And you'd be better off that way, I feel like.
Oh, sorry to cut you off.
Nope, you're good.
I was just going to say, check your equipment. Make sure your bow's on. Have it target in camp or shoot it. 'Cause I've been in a scenario where I hunted a buck all season when I was younger, and finally got my shot on November 7th and didn't realize my rest had moved, and I shot a foot underneath him. That's no fun.
Worst case scenario right there.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Ah, man. Well, this has been really good stuff, guys. I really appreciate it. And for people that want to follow what you're doing this year, and all the content, can one of you give us a lowdown on where people can tap into all your content, how they can follow along, what they can see and expect?
Go ahead, Aaron.
The Hunting Public. Go and check it out on YouTube. We've got all kinds of new episodes there right now. And I don't know, how many episodes are we into the deer tour right now, Greg?
Upwards of 30.
Oh, upwards of 30. Okay.
I think getting close.
Yeah. And we've got a pile of really cool stuff this next week. And then we're heading to Tennessee to hunt during the first part of the rut. Zingers out in Ohio. Got all kinds of gun season deer camp action also coming up towards the middle and the end of November. And then we're going to go south in December. We're going to hunt down in Georgia for the first time. So that should be really exciting too. So, yep, just check us out on YouTube at The Hunting Public, Instagram at The Hunting Public, Facebook, and we've also got episodes streaming on Amazon Prime.
Awesome. Well, you guys are killing it. Everything you're putting out there is really, really good. So if for some reason you're listening to this podcast right now and you live under a rock and you haven't checked out The Hunting Public, let this be the thing that changes that for you. Go watch it. Go check out their stuff. And Aaron, Greg, thank you, and good luck these coming days.
Thanks,
yeah,
dude.
thanks, Mark.
You too.
You as well.
Appreciate it. All right, and that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed this one. It was a long one, so props to all of you that made it through. But hopefully you learned some good stuff, and you can put that into action on your hunts. So good luck. Have a great time. Be safe. And until next time, stay wired to hunt.
Hey everybody, listen up. I got mega huge news. Meat Eater Live is heading back out on the road. That's right. Join me and the crew. Clay Newcomb, Cal, Yanni, Spencer's going to be there. Phil the engineer's going to be there. Meat Eater Live headed back out. Now, when you get every ticket, okay, every ticket you buy, you get a signed copy of our new Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook. This tour is celebrating the release of the book. Buy a ticket, get a signed copy, Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, camp stove, and campfire, which I'll point out is a $38 value. Here's where we're going to go. April 23rd, the Mesa Art Center in Mesa, Arizona. April 24, the Balboa Theater in San Diego. April 25, the Grove in Anaheim, California. April 27, the Crest Theater in Sacramento. April 29, the Union in Salt Lake City. April 30, the Egyptian in Boise. May 1, the Wilma Theater in Missoula. May 2, the Bing Crosby Theater in Spokane, Washington. May 4, Revolution Hall in Portland, Oregon. And May 5, the last day of the tour, Pantages Theater in Tacoma, Washington. For tickets and more information, visit the events page at themeateater.com. Hope to see you at the show.